Sean Oliver, Kayfabe Commentaries here. Back to the Territories, hosted by Jim Cornette, co-written by Jim Cornette. It was all Corny, this show. Very much his sensibility, going over the history of territories throughout the United States. Kevin Sullivan joined us to do Florida. And Kevin got his start down there. Kevin got his start working there, booking, and was so close to Eddie Graham, the legendary promoter of the territory, and Eddie's son, Mike, that Kevin could tell stories from the inside. He was the perfect guest for this edition of the series. When you think Florida wrestling, when you think Florida today, you think of the hurricane. But when you think Florida wrestling, you think violence, blood. They were cutting edge in that aspect, that it had a hardcore vibe to it. I remember reading the magazines. I didn't get Florida television up in, we had the New York television by me. So in the early 80s, mid 80s, I wasn't able to see the product. But the magazines, I remembered seeing there was probably more blood per issue from coming out of the Florida articles and pictures of the matches. So this is a great retrospective of the time that Florida was lighting it up. I think the talent all liked to work down there. It's all discussed here. He'll give you the loop, what they did each night of every week, how they covered the territory, the names that came through. It's Florida, covered soup to nuts with Corny and the Devil, Kevin Sullivan.
Of all the classic wrestling territories, there was one that numbered among the smallest geographically, but exerted an oversized influence on the world of pro wrestling and the people in it: Championship Wrestling from Florida. That outsized influence was due to one man, Eddie Graham. Called a genius, even a visionary by wrestlers and promoters around the world, he named champions, settled disputes, often decided the winners of promotional wars, and produced more successful booking proteges than any other promoter. Graham did all that from his home base in Tampa, Florida, the wrestling capital of a state where the sport had a clean public image and its stars were household names. For 25 years, pro wrestling was a nightly event before big crowds, before it ended in tragedy, in questions with no real answers. This is the story of Eddie Graham's empire in the Sunshine State, Championship Wrestling from Florida. Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Back to the Territories here from Kayfabe Commentaries. I'm Jim Cornette, and once again, the DeLorean alternator trouble, but fortunately, Professor Whoopi had the Wayback Machine that he was able to let us have, and we can now go back to the golden years of Championship Wrestling from Florida. And our guest to discuss one of the great promotions, one of the great territories, is uniquely qualified because he worked there not only as talent in 2 different decades, also as a booker, possibly even a surrogate son to Eddie Graham. What has God wrought? Ladies and gentlemen, the devil himself, Kevin Sullivan.
Kevin,
thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
Anybody in the business, Florida was known as going to work for Eddie Graham.
Right.
And anytime somebody talks about Championship Wrestling from Florida, it is Eddie Graham's story, maybe even more so than the other territories, because his impact was not only felt in his own territory, but it reached around the country and around the world in his proteges and the people that he mentored and the disputes he settled and the champions that he decided. Talk about Eddie Graham, the person. You knew him well.
Okay, here's something that to me was amazing. Eddie Graham probably dropped out of school in the 5th grade. Eddie became a pilot, a captain of the industry, right?
Yeah.
He was a captain of a boat, you know. He could take a 20-ton boat around the world if he wanted to. Eddie was a fanatic, you know, you got OCD and you understand this. Details, details, details. I mean, sometimes I wonder, now I look back on it, you know, was sometimes put pressure on some of the guys, because I've told you this story, Jimmy, that when I first started, he gave me a finish. When I first got in the territory, I think they tested everybody this way, but he gave me a finish, and it was like, and it was with Bobby Shane, so I was working with an incredible worker.
The boy wonder.
Yeah, and the thing was, Bobby was a big fan of mine, and he really wanted me to do well in the business. So the finish was like, we have a double crash, but I go outside the ring, right? And Bobby gets up, he hits the ropes, goes give me the tackle. I come over the top, sunset flip him. He kicks out. I end up going on the apron. He goes to run my head into the post. I put my foot up on the post, take his head, hit it off the turnbuckle. Bobby staggers, gives me a chance to climb. I dive to give him the flying body press. Bobby gets it, rolls me through. 1, 2, kick out, backslide. And I mean, this went on for about 6 minutes, but during the finish was I was going to hit Bobby with 3 drop kicks, and Bobby was putting me over because he was a huge star, and you know, they didn't expect it. So before the finish was, I was supposed to hit him with 3 drop kicks, and now the length of this finish, I was not talking to anybody after I went in. Eddie had his own little room. You go in, he'd sit you down, and well, this is, we're going to take the gold, put it in the pan, and we're going to sift it out. Anything we don't need, we're going to get rid of it, because we're going to have, at the end of this night, we're going to have nothing but gold nuggets. This is going to be a gold nugget match. So right away you're saying, boy, he's got, you know.
Yeah, he's building you up, right?
Yeah,
You're about to walk through hell with gasoline britches on. Yeah.
And then he starts this finish, and okay. And you got to remember, I had just come in from Nick, right?
Yeah.
What are you going to do for finish?
Sunset flip.
Yeah, sunset flip, swamp hacket. I'm going, So I'm walking around, and I'm like, oh, but don't please talk to me, you know. So, like I said, the finish probably was 3.5 minutes long. And I thought I was great. And now he had given finishes for 8 matches that night. Some of them, a couple of tags, you know, so it was not an easy night for him either. So I come back up. What do you think, Ed? And he says to me, where was the 3rd drop kick? Just turned around and left out. I went, whoa. I'm never going to get anything by him if he's just, you know, and he's watching matches before me and after me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I didn't run up to see him right away. It was like a couple of matches later, and he could remember it. So his attention to detail, I think, you know, we've talked about this, Jimmy. I think the guys from his era, Eddie, Mark Lewin, the guys that became good bookers, they were all around Buddy Rogers.
Yeah.
And they all wanted to emulate Buddy. And like we've talked about, Buddy put in different move sequencing, if you will. He put in different moves. So I think these guys took that. Also, Eddie learned a lot from Funk Sr. and Doc Cipolla out there. And he's actually out in Amarillo as Rip Rogers, you know, Buddy's cousin.
Which is where our good friend Hustler Rip Rogers got his name in the modern day. But yeah, he was supposed to be Buddy Rogers' cousin Rip in Amarillo.
Yeah, so I think that you can look back and say, you know, the seed for this was planted by Buddy. And the guys that wanted to keep up understood that Buddy was, you've told me, he'd go into territory with the guys that he wanted to work with, that weren't going to hurt him, and they were going to make him look good.
That were beholden to him and would stand up with him instead of the promoter in
Right.
case they made a power play for the better payoffs.
Right.
Which is why he was installing his crew to begin with, which
Right.
is the way he almost took over Vince Sr.'s territory
Right.
until Bruno's fan club president stooged it off because she heard it while she was visiting Buddy's wife. But that's another story.
Yeah.
Eddie Graham, like you said, 5th grade education or whatever, but he was a licensed pilot, and he was a captain of the industry. He had a TV empire and all these live events and everything, but he was in the business. He was viewed as a visionary, as a creative genius. His finishes were the best. They were tried and true over years of working in front of big crowds and knowing what gets people's emotions, right? And being able to see the talent and see who he wanted them to be and how he wanted them to be portrayed for the people to grab onto him. But he was a guy that settled disputes.
Right.
Was there anybody more powerful in the NWA? Him, Barnett, and
No, Eddie was the most powerful guy. There might have been guys close to him.
and Sam Muchnick as
Yeah,
the president
yeah.
and over a period of time, but
But if there was a debate, Eddie settled the debate. They went his way. I'll tell you a real quick story. I went to St. Louis, and the night I was there was Flair's first time in St. Louis. So that was, to me, they were thinking about him as the world champion.
Whenever
because-
you went to St. Louis and got put over, that
Yeah.
was a stepping stone to the
Yeah,
NWA title.
and usually, whoever won the Missouri state title would become the champion. I mean, you could go back to Brisco, Bobby Backlund, everybody. And I remember Rick coming to me and asking me about a move that he didn't know. And I didn't want him to falter because
Right.
this is St. Louis, right? Yeah. So I went to Pat O'Connor because Pat brought me in for that night. And I actually worked with Pat. I said, I think you need to kind of tailor this finish for Rick a little bit different. And he asked me the problem. I told him what I thought. And I said, you don't want the kid to fall on his ass because they've sent him here, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
I was smart enough to understand. And he said, well, I'll be right back. I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to go on the phone to Eddie and get a better finish. I went to myself, they're calling Eddie. He's not here. I don't know if he's seen Flair work yet. Probably has, up in Mid-Atlantic. But they weren't sure of their own finish. They want to make sure that Eddie...
Call Eddie. Get Tampa on the phone.
Yeah.
Well, you remember when Jerry Jarrett split off from Nick Goulas in 1977? Nick had been a member of the NWA since 1949. And the only support he got was from the Sheik because they were close and he got a bunch of talent down from Detroit. Talent, I say loosely.
Yeah.
But nothing else from the NWA. And 6 weeks, the war was over. Jarrett had won. He took Memphis. His first card back in the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis. Who's on the card? Jack Brisco, Dusty Rhodes, Mike Graham, Kevin Sullivan, and Eddie Graham came in the back, right? To show that I've validated Jerry Jarrett's promotion because everybody knows Nick's a tightwad, and that was the way it was.
And that was the night Holly wrestled Dusty.
Yep.
And there was, he had another presence. The first time the old Omni ran, Jimmy, Mike and I were on that show. And the other thing was, he was, God bless Mike, he was one of my dearest friends, and he was under a horrible strain with the father in different situations. We'll get to that. But Eddie knew that Mike wasn't going to be the world heavyweight champion.
Yeah.
But he also knew that Mike was a good talent, and he wanted Mike to be in the wrestling business. So he actually would, book Mike in these, not just Mike, myself, and different guys in his territory that we went out. We became almost a little bit more desirable. It reminds me of, I always tell a story, when Coors, you couldn't get it, west.
Past Denver or whatever, yeah.
It was that mystique. People would drive out and get it. He made Florida a mystique place, you know what I mean? They had more wrestling, which they hadn't seen. They had their champion for years, Brisco, was a wrestler, right?
Yeah.
So he was very much into that. And the other thing, how clever he was, he had not the U.S. Senator give him a flag on a wrestling program, right?
Yeah.
The mayor of Tampa gave me an award and Mike an award different times. I mean, he had political clout.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, because the one thing that I used to note when I would watch the Florida tape was it seemed like every week somebody was giving Eddie Graham or the promotion a civic award.
Right.
The Boy Scouts, the Boys and Girls Club, the Boys Ranch, the ball team of some kind, the amateur wrestling team, local sports kid, just anybody that was deserving. Eddie Graham would have done something, or he had the company do something to help out. And as a result, for weeks and weeks and years, they saw him getting these civic honors and awards that showed not only was wrestling a good, wholesome sport, but that Eddie Graham was the next best thing to the president. And it had an effect in that, I think, just judging from what I was able to see, the brief period that I would go down there, wrestling it was like in the Carolinas. People liked wrestling in the Carolinas, and it had a bit better of an image.
Right.
It had a better image in Florida than it did in most places because of that kind of work and the people seeing, well, even if we may not like wrestling, they sure are doing good for the community.
Right.
And that was, of course, brilliant. It was great PR. It helped everybody.
And the other thing, Jimmy, as you know, very little, we'll say in Nashville, because of Nick, not many people would write articles on wrestling, right?
Right.
Eddie had a lot of newspapermen in his pocket. They were on the payroll.
Yeah.
So they may do an article about Eddie Graham. If you watched, Channel 44 last week, you saw that Eddie Graham received the Award of Freedom from the state senator, U.S. congressman. And after that, he'd go into the percentage that the boys club, the Sheriff's Boys Ranch, and oh, by the way, last week in Fort Lauderdale, police officer died on duty. Eddie donated the money for the proceeds in Fort Lauderdale to his family.
Yeah.
So then, as the article kept on going, and then they would say, and Dusty Rhodes is wrestling high race in St. Pete this Sunday. It looks to be a great exhibition. Dusty is coming into his own, and they would just drop that little word, exhibition, rather than, so they could get out of it gracefully and still plug the town. And he had that going for him in Tampa, he had it in Miami, he had it in all the major clubs. So yeah, and the other thing is, it's kind of hard after you see all this good stuff, then Dusty comes on and hangs me and I got juice shooting up 4 rows out. The people say, well, they do good for the community, you know? They might have done good for the community, but not my head, you know what I mean? But yeah, you're absolutely right.
When you first came in, it was to be Mike's partner. Mike had turned pro probably about a year before, and Eddie had been a top star in Florida in the early 60s. That's how he got in that position, which we'll go into when we talk about the history of the territory. But he'd never focused on himself as a single after that initial setup period. He didn't put the singles belt on him. He and Sam Steamboat or a few partners would have tag team titles on occasion. But he had actually announced and publicly had bought into the promotion with Cowboy Luttrel, who'd been the Florida promoter since the 40s. But when Mike started wrestling, he even went so far, Eddie did, as to have the newspapers print that he had given his promoting interest, his matchmaking interest, over to Buddy Fuller.
Right.
And that he was going to go on the road with his son Mike as a father-son tag team. He didn't want the people to think that, okay, now my son's here and I'm the promoter and I'm going to be wrestling and he's going to go over. It was that attention to detail that set him apart. But when you became Mike's partner right after that, how did you get that spot, and how did you first start your relationship with Eddie?
This is a funny thing. I actually went to Florida with Robert to be Robert's partner.
Robert Fuller?
Yeah, and Robert and I were going to go to Australia together, be partners, because we had been partners in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And
that was at a period of time, not to digress, but Barnett had brought Lester Welch, one of the Welches into Australia as a partner, and then Jimmy Golden made a trip, so there was a Tennessee-Australia connection there for just a second.
Right, so we were going to go, and I mean, they offered a ridiculous amount of money for those days, I thought, and Robert said, no, and this is how well planned, Eddie, what you just said, laid it out. Robert comes up to me and says, no, my dad just took over Florida. We're going to go to Florida instead. So Robert's buying that his dad has his territory, right? Now Ronald owned West Palm Beach, right?
Yeah.
So when we get down there, we'll book maybe for the first week around together. The second week, I'm in singles, Robert's in singles. And Eddie saw, and I think Bobby Shane went to Eddie and said, they look alike, they're the same size. I think it would be good to have a young tag team. I'd like to get them over. Bobby was a really, we've talked about Bobby before. Yeah. It's too bad that people don't know who he was. He could make a guy in a night, right? And especially two young punks. But when I got with them, this is how much attention to detail Eddie was. Eddie said to me, have you ever wrestled before? Amateur. I said, yeah, I have. He said, okay, I want you to come to the Heroes Gym tomorrow and we'll work out. You and Mike will just work out. I thought he meant weights. Well, I get there and all there are is mats on the floor, right? So Eddie says, okay, why don't you guys go at it? And Mike was very good and exceptionally strong, right? But I think I could.
He was a pretty world-class level power lifter in his younger days, right?
He had the record in Florida, I believe, for the longest time. He benched 425 at 198. And Mike had exceptionally strong tendons. And Mike was a tough guy. I mean, he wasn't going to let his old man down. You know what I mean? He was going to stand up for the business. Mike stood up for business. Back then it was a different game. So they get me wrestling Mike, and I'm not going to say that I could have beat him, but I'm smart enough to realize I better not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I better hold my own.
Yeah.
And I did hold my own. And
you can't be a pushover, but you got to do the job in the end.
Yeah. So I often thought, why did he do that? And I thought, well, if we put me and Mike together and I got the shit kicked out of me, they wouldn't say Kevin Sullivan got the shit kicked out of him in a bar. They were going to say Mike Graham did.
Yeah, because he was the one that was famous, and you guys looked so much alike at the time.
Yeah. So Eddie wanted to make sure I could cover my ass, I think. And because back in those days, if you got in a fight, and Stan Lane would tell you that, I mean, he had to leave the territory, right? Because he beat up a guy so bad.
Yeah.
If you lost the fight, you were gone. You know what I mean?
If you lost the fight, you got fired, and if you won the fight, you had to leave town because you got sued.
Yeah.
And so then, gradually over a period of time, you got closer with Eddie.
Yeah. I had, because I was around Mike so much, and it got to be a point where Eddie kind of, I think, I say this reflecting back, I'm sure he liked me, and he liked that I would do what Mike wanted to do, like go to the gym. I was trying to keep, on the straight and narrow, but we were two wild young kids. But he says to me one day, you want to go fishing? And I said, wow, this is strange. I said, what time is Mike going to pick me up? He said, no, you come down the dock. Thinking, wow. So I'm on the dock, and we'll get into this in a little while. And I go out fishing with Eddie. Now he starts telling me the problems he's having with Mike, because Eddie himself is having marital problems or pseudo-marital problems, right? And he unloads on me and tells me something that only Barnett and Terry Funk knew. So I'm now given this secret code that...
And you carry the burden.
Yeah, and I carry the burden, and I also have Mike up my ass because I'm not understanding what the problem is between his mother and father, but I do understand what the problem is. There's no problem, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He just doesn't understand it. So as this continued on, and we'll get into whenever you want.
Well, go ahead. Go
okay.
ahead. We're this far now. We can just jump right
What
in.
happened was, when Eddie was in Amarillo, he got divorced after Mike was born, like maybe when Mike was 2 or 3. But because he loved his boy so much that he stuck with his wife. And they moved to Florida, like you said, the whole thing. They moved into a trailer park, and then from the next thing, he buys the company that he's living this magnificent home, swimming pools. He bought Mike one right down the street, swimming pools. And they were like very civil to one another. They went everywhere in Florida together, you know, Miss and Mrs. Graham.
Yeah.
But nobody knew they weren't married. There was only 3 people that knew they weren't married. So now, and Mike, before he died, found out about it and confronted me. And it was the hardest thing in the world for me to tell him. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "How could I have told you?" You know?
Yeah.
And then he said, "Now I look back on it, things fall into place." He said, "I would guess I was too hard on my dad." I said, "Yeah, and it wasn't my place to tell you, you know?" So he stays with Lucy, but they weren't married, and I think they were allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. He had a girlfriend. Mike got mad about that. And Mike's mother was a Southern belle, genteel, and she could have been a model at 55 to 60 years old, striking red hair. She owned the boutique in Florida. Then she had a special place before I ever saw these fake nails, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah,
She opened that up, and I mean, everybody was going to Lucy's. You'd walk in, and they were poured from a bottle of Dom Perignon, not the cheap stuff, you know. The ladies are sitting there thinking they're queen for the day.
If she was really a wrestling wife, she'd have put the cold duck in the Dom Perignon bottle in there.
Yeah.
Oh, you like that one? Huh? There you go.
But the thing was, so I kind of became the surrogate son because Eddie's bitching. And then I told you just a little while ago, one time we're fishing, it was a Thursday, and we have to go to Jacksonville. So you'd have to leave early because that was one of the longest trips in the territory. It's about 220 miles, and it was not all interstate.
Yeah, I remember that.
Remember
You got
that?
to go with the Yeehaw Junction and all that stuff. Yeah.
So I go to Eddie. I need to get back to the dock. He said, "Nah, the fish are hitting. Come on, let's stay." I said, I'm supposed to meet Mike." He said, "Mike will know you're not there. I told him you're going fishing. I'll fly you." Thinking, boy, I'm flying up to Jacksonville and Mike is driving. This is going to be nice when I get there, right? Yeah. And Mike was really cool about it. He said, "Hey, I understand. I'm just not getting along with my dad." He said, "Good for you. You didn't have to drive." You know what I mean? So that's how I became close to him. And then because I became close to him that way, he would kind of, I tell you one time that I really shocked him, and I probably cost this guy his job, okay? Louis Tillette, you know the Dusty finish?
Yes.
That's Louis Tillette's finish, okay? So at the end of the year, they had, the year in review, and most of it was Brisco against somebody,
Yeah.
And there was, if not the greatest babyface, one of the top 10, right? Jack Brisco. I'm watching the thing, and every finish is a Dusty finish. So Eddie comes out beaming because, it's like anything else. If you watch it enough.
Yeah.
And he didn't watch it, I found out, see? So he was going to go through me and see what my reaction was. Then he was going to look at it. And he said, "What did you think?" And I said, "It sucked." It was the first time I ever said anything like that to him. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Every finish was exactly alike." Well, he went down. He went to got Dave Togie, made him go take the tape back then and put it in. He watched it. Louis was relegated to the second towns, and that's how Dusty got his start in Dusty and Watts. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so that was, when that happened, then he would let me sit in, and Dusty too, when Dusty came in, but when he found someone that he kind of thought that was on the same wavelength with him, like the Funks or the Briscoes, you know, he'd say, hey, sit in here and tell me what you think about this. Well, I'll tell you a funny story about Eddie. I'm happy to be driving to Orlando with him. And Eddie said, well, I got this finish. He said, and this is what they're going to do in the main event. And he said, but I'm not going to say anything. He said, just come in with me. And this was a big thing going into the heel dressing room, you know?
Yeah.
You know, even though in Orlando it would be like coming in here, no one's going to see us, but we didn't do that. So I sat down, I watched Eddie work. He said, boys, what are you going to do tonight? And they're all scratching their heads and, you know, figuring things out. Jimmy, in 15 minutes, they came up with the exact same finish Eddie had told me in the car. He just steered them that way, and they had no idea which way they were going either. The only few guys that, this is how smart he was. Terry Funk is going to work with Jack Brisco in Miami. Now, when the Funks came in, 98% of the time, Eddie would go to wherever the Funks were wrestling.
Right.
So they were only coming in, Terry was only coming in from Miami because Jack was going to wrestle Dory at the end of the month. We'll say it was the first of the month, and at the end of the month he was going to wrestle Dory for the title. So Louis Tillett goes over, and Terry says, what do you want to do? And he said, you don't mind putting him over in the middle, do you? Terry said, no, of course not. So the next day we got TV, and Eddie comes in and he said, hey, what did you do? What kind of out did you give Funk last night? And Louis said, oh, he said he'd lose in the middle of the ring. And Eddie said, I guess we won't see Terry for a while. So Louis calls Terry up, you know, make sure everything's okay. He said, when Dory comes in, we'd like you to work with Morocco. He said, I can't, my horse is sick.
Horse is sick.
You know, he did the horse is sick. And Eddie said, Louis, that isn't the way to get these guys to do what you want. He said, and with beating Terry,
They'll do what you want once to get out of there, and then they won't come back.
Yeah.
Hey, let's get Eddie Graham in Florida first of all, because some of these young whippersnappers may not realize the career he had before then, why he was in a position to buy the territory, why he was in a position to be in the main events. Started out Eddie Gossett, his real name, in the Tennessee territory because he's from around Chattanooga, and wrestled in Tennessee early years. He was in Texas as Rip Rogers, like you said, but he also had a run in Florida in like 1954 as Eddie Gossett.
Really?
And I don't even think he had blonde hair at that point in time. Apparently nobody remembered him, but what they did remember him for was the run in the Northeast in Madison Square Garden. When he became a Graham brother. Dr. Jerry Graham, one of the most famous, most eccentric heels in the history of the business. Vince McMahon Jr.'s favorite wrestler.
Right.
Red suits, Cadillac, no top, down the Broadway in lighting cigars with $100 bills and the whole 9 yards. He became Jerry Graham's brother, and they weren't the first of the bleach blonde tag teams, but they were one of the best known. They sold out the Garden. They were big all over the Northeast. The Capitol Wrestling tape at that point was syndicated to a variety of stations. So the Graham brothers and their manager, Bobby Davis, who Bobby Heenan was named after, were big-time heels. And when he left, Eddie Graham left the Northeast, he went to Florida. He won the Florida title in 1962. That's when Cowboy Luttrel still owned the company. I think he bought in shortly thereafter, probably with the money that he'd made in New York.
Right.
But that started a lifelong connection between Eddie and Vince Sr. because there was always cooperation between the WWF and the Florida territory, even if it didn't go through the NWA or whatever, even to the point where Vince had a winter home in Florida or a summer home or whichever season he spent in Florida. And the tapes, the Florida tape was shown in New York on the Spanish station. Everybody thought, well, that's an accident. No. Was Eddie probably the only guy that could pick up the phone and talk to Vern Gagne, Sam Muchnick, and Vince McMahon Sr. anytime he wanted to?
I think he was the only guy that could pick up the phone and be on their level.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because they all respected him about his brain. And I'll give you a quick story, real quick.
Take your time.
Jack Brisco was our world champion, right, in WAB. And Vince got a little scared of the ethnic champions, Bruno and Pedro, after Mulligan had been stabbed.
They were having so many riots, either the Puerto
Right.
Ricans upset if
Right.
Pedro ever lost, or et cetera, and they were having troubles.
And Mulligan almost got filleted, when
Yeah.
he got stabbed so many times. And then the guy had put urine on the knife, so he got an infection inside. I was up in the office when this happened. Vince, it was in the wintertime, Vince was down in Florida. He lived by Lauderdale by the sea. He lived in a beautiful cul-de-sac. Right here was his home. Grand Wizard's home's right over here, so I've been both. So he decided that he wanted to do what Eddie did with Jack Brisco.
An All-American boy.
An All-American boy. And Vince had watched the Florida wrestling, and he said, hey, I like that guy Backlund. He's an All-American boy, amateur wrestler, all this. And Eddie said to him, yeah, he's great, but you want to take Kern because of his father's background. If you're looking for the All-American boy, and the kid can talk better than Bobby, and I think you can make a lot more money quicker with Steve, in the angle with the father.
Who was a war hero and a prisoner of war in
twice,
Vietnam.
Vietnam and World War II.
That's right.
So he said, no, I'm going to go with Backlund. And they got in this little kind of jousting where they were laughing. And Eddie said, I bet you $100 that you can't make Backlund like you can Kern. And he said, oh, I'll make him okay. And that's what he did, right? He built it. It was over.
Did he get the $100?
Yes, yes, he did. I mean, so, yeah, like you said, could Eddie pick up the phone? Yeah, and when Eddie called you, I mean, I had heard Vince call Eddie before a big taping or when he was going to switch the title. What do you think I should do for the next show? Who do you see that's ready? And Eddie would give him a finish, you know what I mean? But, the funny thing was, when he sent that finish up there, it wasn't a Florida finish. It was a version of a Florida finish.
That would fit their style and their pattern. They tailored it to.
Yeah.
And that's something, now that I'm sitting here looking at it on paper, when Graham made his move after the run in the Northeast and went to Florida, that was the last move he made.
Yeah.
It was, and you very seldom find that. Vern did it in Minneapolis. Lawler did it. Basically came back from, Florida and Georgia in '75 and it never really left again.
Right.
But he stayed. He bought into the territory, and at the time, Florida traditionally was a good, solid business state, but it had never done anything spectacular. There weren't the outdoor shows or the stadium shows or whatever. But it was good, solid business. And talk about the towns and 25 years of history of the territory. I know the nights changed and the schedule changed and whatever, but typically in the glory years, what was your week? What were the towns?
I'm going to tell you again how Eddie was a forward thinker. When Eddie went down there and bought in, that territory only ran in the winter.
Really? It wasn't even year round?
Wasn't year round. And Eddie said, the Cowboy, he said, you're just catering to tourists. We need to cater to the good old boys that live down here.
Yeah.
You got to realize at that time, Florida was really rural. It was the second largest cattle producing state. Of course, it was the first in citrus, right? A lot of vegetables growing up there. A lot of migrant workers. If you look back at the beginning of Eddie's run, you see Cyclone Negro, you see Jose Lothario, Hispanics. Eddie used blacks early, So, I mean, he had a grasp of things that most of us wouldn't have got the grasp, especially back then, those old-time promoters, I mean? They weren't civic-minded or didn't even know, what was going on, really.
We do it this way because this is the way we always did it.
Right. So when he opened it up, what they would do is Sunday was Orlando, Monday was West Palm, Tuesday was Tampa and Fort Pierce, if he wanted to cool you down, Fort Myers, if he wanted to cool you down for a while, he'd send you to Fort Myers. When I had my run with Mike and they broke us apart for a while, he sent me to Fort Myers with Dickie Slater and said, you two book the town. I don't care what you do, just give me a list of the town and I'll tell you if you can have them. But you got to have this booked, you got to have it 3 weeks out so I know what you're going to do. And then if I have to take somebody, I will. So Dickie and I got a chance to really get our feet wet, right? So, but Wednesday was Miami. Thursday was Jacksonville. Friday was either Fort Lauderdale or Tallahassee. And Saturday was once a month Lakeland, which was right outside of Tampa. St. Pete, right outside of Tampa. Sarasota, right outside of Tampa. And Daytona, right outside of Orlando. So he would...
And also West Palm, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami are like 60 miles apart for the three of them over on the other side.
Right, right. And he
different cards everywhere.
Yeah, not like, we'll say with Nick, where he ran the same card in every town, you know what I mean? And Eddie would also kind of back off of West Palm a little because he would take West Palm on a Monday to be the showcase for Leave 'Em Hanging till Wednesday, that match is coming, you know what I mean? It'd be like the Midnight Express, wrestling, fantastic, so God love him too. But the Rock and Roll hit the ring and saved them, But isn't it a coincidence the Rock and Roll
and Midnight Wrestling on Wednesday, just right down the road. Come on.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, you talk about it being weekly, and for a lot of those years, Miami Beach did 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people a week.
Every week.
And that's not in the hot periods, that's just regularly, every Wednesday night at the convention hall. Dusty used to talk about, for all of you folks old enough, Jackie Gleason used to tape his television show there. From Miami Beach, the greatest audience in the world. Dusty loved to sneak in to the dressing room that Jackie Gleason would use and shit on Jackie Gleason's toilet. See, just, to say their asses had been in the same place. That's another thing when you talk about cooling somebody down. The really artistic bookers used to be able to do that because after a guy's been in a hot program.
Right.
And all of a sudden, you can't just, be the main event every week from now till the end of time, but you don't want to diminish the guy's status, so how can I miss you if you won't go away? The fans in Tampa wouldn't see him because he'd be over in the other town and do a little program there because that was the secondary town. They didn't get to see the top talent all the time, so they're glad to have this main event guy that's worn out his welcome over here.
Right.
And he was able in the same state, while using everybody on television, to still put the pieces together where you created a demand for a guy that's still in your territory and never went anywhere.
Right.
That's amazing. And also that you had the Bahamas every so often, right?
Well, I forgot about that. The Bahamas ran once a month, and that was Nassau, and then every other month Nassau and Freeport would run. But when Eddie first took over Florida, Cuba ran. And when I first went to Florida, Eddie had Puerto Rico. So we go to Puerto Rico.
And can you imagine wrestling in Cuba? They probably now that may be the last untapped wrestling market, Cuba, because they haven't seen wrestling in 50 years, right?
Yeah.
They'll still believe it.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
What were the houses like and the crowds like in the other towns on average? I mean, I know there's peaks and valleys, but to get a grip of in one state, how many people were buying tickets to see live wrestling matches just per week? It's insane.
Jimmy, in all the houses that we're talking about, if it wasn't half full or three-quarters full, something was wrong. Something was going to be altered quickly.
And you're talking about buildings that seat 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people.
Yeah, some of them seat more.
Yeah.
And the beauty of this was, on Sunday you went to Orlando, you knew if Saturday TV got over, because Orlando was the barometer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was, even though Orlando is Orlando now, back then it was a, urban center where the town met the farm, you know what I mean? So you're drawn from two sections of people. So if it got over in Orlando, you knew, okay, we'll build on this TV. But if it didn't get over in Orlando, that program would be done and dusted.
Done and do something else.
Yeah. So he just had a.
We're going to go all over the place, and folks, you bear with us. You're going to get knowledge here. It's just going to be. I see one guy's nodding off already, but that's. Was it Orlando? Was it you and Blackjack that did the thing where you fought out the back door?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us. That's one of my favorite things of all time.
I was lucky enough, Jimmy, that, I had monsters to work with, So they, I always say this. The movie The Alien? Remember when the guy's sitting there?
Yeah,
and this little thing this big gets out? What if they took a fly swatter and went, "Puh," So at the end of the movie, you remember how big the monster was?
Yeah.
Well, is that in our head, or is that monster have grown that big, right? So that's what they did to me. They made me a monster from this big, right? So, and I was lucky to work with all these big baby faces. So Mulligan and I go get into the thing. Dusty comes up with the idea. He says, "I want you to fight outside and go out in the back." And this was in a huge, Orlando Sportatorium was like in a huge field, right?
Yeah.
So we go out fighting, and we're fighting down the road, and people are trying to get out, but they couldn't get out the back door, so they're going out the front. We're fighting in the field, and Blackjack slamming me in the dirt and all this.
It's pitch black dark
Pitch
outside.
black dark out, and he's whacking me in the head, and he's stiff as board, but he can't see. So that's the end, Finally, we get away and we go for each other, and the cops come, and the next week, as the matches start, me and Blackjack come through the front door like we've been fighting all week.
Wearing the same shit, right?
Wearing the same shit and dirty, and come roll right through the ring and stop. The guys in the ring stop working, look at us, and we go right out of the ring and down the aisle.
Now, see, that sounds like something that I wouldn't be into. But no, the level of creativity and just for the visual, and it didn't. It just all right. There were great local promoters down there too, because Eddie had a small office, because all the territories did.
Right.
We talked to Baron von Raschke. Bruiser's office was in his garage.
Yeah.
But they had great local promoters. Don Curtis was in Jacksonville, right? Don Curtis and Mark Lewin were a great tag team years gone by. John Heath in Sarasota, right?
Yeah.
Coach John Heath, who also did the TV show with Gordon Soley, we'll talk about in a minute. Chris Dundee in Miami was Angelo Dundee's brother, right?
Right.
So that's why the boxing, they had so many famous boxing matches in Miami Beach. One of Cassius Clay's early fights was in Miami Beach.
Against Liston, and the other guy that used to come to matches quite a bit, and he was afraid to death of wrestlers, was Jimmy Ellis. He was
from Louisville too?
Yeah, he was Ali's training partner.
Yeah.
And I think he ended up winning some form of the belt when Ali went to exile, but he would come to the matches, and Chris was smart enough that he would bring fighters in, and I guess he either smartened them up not to be jerks, but they'd be going, I watch them and I'm saying they're overselling us maybe a little, you know what I mean? But invariably, they'd be in a fight at the end of the month themselves in the same building, so it was publicity for them.
And I mean, I'm sure they were, probably preconditioned. They don't say anything. But at the same time, even a heavyweight boxer, when he's standing in front of Joe LeDuc, what are you going to say? You knock the guy's professional and say, pleased to meet you, sir. Any other local promoters?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this guy, O'Hare, I'm trying to think of his first name, Pat O'Hare. He had worked in New England and around the country as an Irish strongman, you know what I mean? I can remember a picture of me seeing him in Boston, which didn't run many pictures of wrestling, of him bending a shoe. He was one of those Joe LeDuc bodies, you know what I mean?
Oh, my God, yeah.
And he was a super guy. I mean, Jimmy, coming from where we had come from, Tennessee, I mean, promoters were brutal to us, right? I mean, most of them. Most of them were brutal.
Well, I never got to meet Nick Gulish. You had to work for Nick too, so that was even worse.
But this Pat O'Hare, he would come in, and his wife would have made sandwiches for the guys or cookies, and he'd buy a couple of cases of shit beer, but it was beer in the thing, and couldn't drink it until after the matches, and take what you want. Eddie just had a way of picking the right guy for the right town, and they took pride in going out like Pat ran small towns like Palatka or Spot Show if we needed it, you know what I mean? And they would go out and really hustle. They joined, again, I just thought of this. They would get with the sheriffs, right, and sell tickets.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there's a $8,000 house, but there's only $4,000 worth of people in there, you know what I mean? The sheriffs would push the people to sell tickets. And they also wanted the local promoters a pat in the ass from Eddie. You know, he was that big a personality, you know?
Well, and also when you had weekly towns, this is something that's been lost in the wrestling business these days. You can't run a house show without somebody in that town. Did the TV play properly?
Right.
Did the promos play? Was the newspaper ad put in place right? The building, the contracts, are they going to have toilet paper in the bathrooms? Just all the things, the advertising poster and this and that. And that's why the successful territory guys would have a guy in each town, or one that spent some time in that town, especially the weekly towns, so that they knew what was going on, and you didn't show up and there's nobody there and everybody's going, well, what happened?
Right.
Because one guy was responsible for everything.
Right. And I think it was, you know, like we said about Nick, he would get these promoters like John Kazana, and he had no relationship with John, even though John owned that territory by himself. Or, you know, the Welshes, they had Dyersburg and Tupelo, whatever they had. But there was no relationship. You know, these promoters knew if they got into a problem, they could call Eddie and say, hey, Eddie, I've tried my best to get this ad at X amount of dollars, and my budget's right here.
Yeah.
Do you think you can loosen up the purse strings and give me an extra, because I feel that this is going to do well, and then the house will do well again the next time? And Eddie would either say, invariably he'd either say yes, or I'll call you back. And Eddie would make a call, and he'd get a favor done, and he wouldn't have to pay for the ads, you know what I mean? And he goes, Pat, go down there, and they're going to give you the ad. Just go down there and sign off on it, you know? So, like you said, everybody, it all came back to Eddie. The buck stopped here, and everybody was accountable for themselves, the promoters, the wrestlers, you know what I mean? Because, you know, he didn't, I'll tell you a story that this is before I was in the business. Valentine, who was one of the great draws of all times, and Red Bastien blew the territory open. So Eddie was, his neighbor came up to me and said, hey, I saw those guys on TV. He said, oh, good. He said, oh, no, I saw them down on the beach barbecuing together. Now they're booked all week on top, and they've been doing big business, right?
Yeah.
Eddie went and called them and said, boys, pack your bags. I don't need your work anymore. Now, would that have happened in today's day and age?
No.
Okay, would it happen?
Now they laugh at him. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Would it happen back in those days with most promoters? They would say, well, we'll figure out a 6 weeks deal.
Yeah,
get rid of them.
as soon as they quit selling out, they're done. Fuck them.
Yeah, but Eddie, I mean, that's taking a chance, you know what I mean? Because now you got rid of the program. And not only you get rid of the program, I don't have to tell you, but a lot of people don't understand this. To get the guy to draw that way, he slaughtered some bodies on the way up, right? So now you got to, you know, Humpty
Now you got to
Dumpty.
rebuild the wounded soldiers after
the.
you know, but at the same time, he was thinking 5 years from now.
Right.
Because it's not about one guy seeing the big program barbecuing together down on the beach. It's about how many times will that happen, and how many times will that guy tell, or people, and how many people that guy tell, and over a period of time it grows. So just like when you look at talent, you don't look at, if you're trying to build a territory and you're looking at young guys, you don't look at how they are now. You look at what they will grow into in 3 to 5 years. He was looking at, if I let this go on, the more times I let it go on, the wider spread it gets, the more damage it's going to do to my business in the long run. And in 5 years, it's going to bite me in the ass, because then everybody's smart, so I'm going to nip it in the bud now.
I'm going to tell you how it was just drilled into your head. Mike and I were partners, and Mike had never done a blade job. And you'll love this. You know what I had in my bag?
One of the chisels
You
from
got
Tennessee.
it. You got it. All
The Ron Wright chisel.
Yeah, all bloodied up for me and Ron and Don and Whitey Caldwell. I had it in my bag. So we were starting to work a program with Blackjack Slade. Do you remember him?
I remember that name.
And Dickie Slater, who was a great performer, right? So Mike said to me, "What's that?" I said, "Well, you put it on your hand and they bust you open." He said, "Whoa." He said, "I'd like to do that." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, because I've never bled. If I bleed, I think it will help the territory." Well, this became the kayfabe. In 2 weeks, we're going to do it on TV. This is how conditioned the guys were. Blackjack Slade had a girlfriend. He had Slater over with his girlfriend, or soon-to-be wife, and they were having a couple of cocktails and eating. And Blackjack Slade's girlfriend said, "Oh, I hear you're going to hit Mike with some kind of chisel." Dickie went right to Eddie. Slade was gone, and Mike never did it. God damn it, I wanted to see that. Because my head was numb for 6 months, you know, but that's how everybody fell in line. And it wasn't stooging. You know what I mean? Sometimes people say, "Oh, the guy was a stooge." No, he was protecting his vested interest of the business and protecting it for Eddie, too, because, you know, the respect that he had.
Well, now let's talk about, we talked about television with Eddie Graham getting a Civic Award every week, but the television went through some changes over 3 decades, but Gordon Solie had come in the late 50s. He did stock car racing, and he was had obviously the incredible vocabulary, the voice, the delivery, called it as a professional sport and he learned wrestling pretty much from Cowboy Luttrel and Eddie Graham all that time too, so he was instructed to call it that way, and it fit his style perfectly. But for the 70s and 80s, when and where did you tape television? And then it showed in every market in Florida with a television station. So those stations overlap. So the television was all across the state. Everybody was an instant TV star because in the days where there was 3 stations in a market. But when and where did you do the TV, and what was the process like?
The TV was done Wednesday morning after Tampa off Fort Myers. If you had to drive back, it sucked, you know, but you're probably in better shape on Wednesday morning than going out in Tampa your night. So it was shot at the office in front of a crowd that was maybe 100 people, had bleachers on 2 sides, actually 3 sides, and chairs. And the same people came Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. And
try to get 100 people now to go to a wrestling show Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock.
No, and they had to pay. They had to pay.
Yeah.
It was a couple of bucks, but they had to pay. And, you know, and then you had to finish that TV, and you either jumped immediately in the car, or you go shower and go to the airport and take a plane and stay over and fly back, because that's when they had Florida Air Florida, and it was like $40 round trip to Miami. But, you know, what you said about Gordon, and you go back, and I mean, JR is fabulous, okay? But Gordon, JR was kind of raised in the business, you know what I'm saying, right? With Watts, he put up rings, he learned different things. Gordon was found at the stock car races, and Mike was the one that found him. He said, "Dad, I like his voice. I think he'd be a good announcer." And Eddie went to him and said, "Do you know anything about it?" And he said, "No." And Gordon had told me the story. Eddie said to him, "Well, I want you to do it. Come to the office like on a Monday." And he said, "We're going to go over some things." And he said to him, "This is a legitimate sport. I want you to produce it that way. I don't want any tongue-in-cheek stuff, because if you look back at the old stuff from Marigold Gardens, you would know who the announcers.
Oh yeah, and the Jack Reynolds I think was his name, but
Jack Brickhouse.
Jack Reynolds was in Cleveland, but look there, Bruiser Affless. Well, he's got him in a hole there, doesn't he, folks? And it was tongue-in-cheek, and it was kind of making mockery, but this was straight as an arrow. Straight as you could get.
And he had such a big influence down there that most people thought he was a part owner, you know what I mean? And he was...
And he was already in probably his 30s, I would say at least, when he started in wrestling.
Mid-30s, you know what I mean? And
maybe that was better. Maybe because he hadn't grown up in the business and he was told as a grown adult, here, this is called this legitimately. We're trying to give the illusion that this is completely straight. And because he had the vocabulary and the broadcasting ability, he was able to then study it and do it the right way instead of coming in with a preconceived.
You know, I never thought of it that way, Jimmy, but that does make a lot of sense.
Because now it's the same thing as trying to teach the wrestlers these days. When you broke in the business 30 years ago or 40 years ago, you knew absolutely nothing about the way anything worked.
Right.
So when they would teach you, you were learning it from scratch. Now you can't train a wrestler anymore because you can't smarten them up, because as soon as they get on the internet, they're smart to everything, and they think they know and exactly what's going on. And it's harder to unlearn something and learn it the right way than it is to learn it from scratch.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, you know, you look back at Gordon and all those characters that were there. I mean, Curtis, Lewin, myself, Abby, Brody, Hanson. I mean, we could go down the list. The Sheik. He was in an invisible shield, surrounded by an invisible shield. You couldn't touch him. You were going to lose your job if you went.
Yeah, let me tell you something.
Yeah.
Hey.
I mean, Eddie had it that, I asked Eddie about that one time. He said, you ever see a football player come up and grab Schenkel? What was his name? Chris Schenkel.
Chris Schenkel.
He said, did you ever see that happen? I said, no. He said, well, we're not going to see it happen here either. Because, let's face it, you know, it's like anything else. Coming up with an idea is very hard every week.
Yeah.
You know, and then you start to take the path of least resistance, right? Let's grab the announcer.
That worked the first 7 times we did it, and nobody's ever done this before. Well, there's probably a reason why nobody's ever done that before. Because it won't be good for you in the long run. I love the TV that they did at the office, because it was kind of like an early OVW, and you could see when some of the guys got up on the top rope, there was that beam running across, right? Okay, we got to watch out for that. But because there was no big budget wrestling programs at the time, it worked.
Right.
And the matches were so good, and the people were screaming and yelling. And the talent, once again, just from the 60s and the 70s, but it was a who's who of Florida, because even if it wasn't the highest paying territory in the business, it was Florida. It was short trips, and you got a chance to work for a genius and be figured in. And if Eddie Graham wanted you to get over, as we'll talk about, you could go anywhere. But in the 60s alone, the singles title, Boris Malenko, Hiro Matsuda, Bob Orton Sr., Cowboy Bob Ellis, Tarzan Tyler, Jack Brisco, Wahoo McDaniel, and Johnny Valentine. Those guys built the Florida territory. On the tag team side, the Von Brauners. Don Curtis and Mark Lewin, Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard, Eddie Graham and Sam Steamboat, and the Infernos, who were hot all over the South. That's an incredible array of talent if you really want to concentrate on in-ring work. And if you really want to concentrate on guys that knew how to work programs and knew how to cut promos and draw money, that's a great way to establish a territory. But almost everybody at one time or another came through Florida, right? You had to.
You had to.
I've got a program at home. The second match on the card is Boris Malenko versus Karl Gotch. And I wonder, hopefully everybody was in a good mood that day. Then we go to the 70s. And you can talk about some of these guys because you were in the ring with every single one of them. But look at this talent in one state territory. Terry Funk, Dick Murdoch, Bobby Shane, Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods, Dusty Rhodes, Joe LeDuc, Cowboy Bill Watts, Harley Race, the Mongolian Stomper, Superstar Billy Graham, Ivan Koloff, Dick Slater, team of Rhodes and Murdoch, the Briscoes and the Funks as a team, Mike Graham and Kevin Sullivan, Mike Graham and Steve Kern. Incredible talent.
Yeah, and the thing was, you know, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they talked about back in the heyday of the 90s, the guys didn't get it. There was a symbiotic relationship. Like the guys that were working underneath thinking they should be working on top, when these guys on top are making $3 million a year. And if you were in Turner, if you sat them down, the North Tower is going to call you and say, what do you got this guy in the second match for? They don't care if he can't work, right?
Yeah.
So in Florida, there was a symbiotic relationship with the people, with the guys. Everybody knew because Eddie had laid it out. Okay, if Jack was going to wrestle Tim Woods, that night was a wrestling night. We put away any over the top violence, okay?
Right.
But if Terry Funk and Jack wrestled, they were going to have a violent match at the end. You know,
Yeah.
Terry's going to hit him with a branding iron or a dead chicken or something, right? Or a toilet seat. But you couldn't do anything on the floor that night. You know what I mean? Everybody was accountable for every time they got in the ring.
You couldn't do anything on the floor because first thing that a Funk was going to do was throw you out of the ring.
Yeah.
Jerry Lawler told me one time, I worked with Dory Funk and Terry Funk, and I've never had anybody throw me out of the ring. They just one side, and he'd get in and throw him out the other side.
Yeah.
So that you knew, so you would build your card to have none of what they were going to get in the main event, so they'd wait for it and they'd see it.
And Jimmy, again, I'm using the word accountable. He put it down that if you can't figure this out after I've told you, you're not here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He just had a way. And after a while, you kind of knew that most of these guys here that you've mentioned, right, are going on, they're going to use Florida, they're going to produce unbelievable matches, but the Funks are going back to Amarillo. Jack is going to be the world champion. Tim is going to end up going back to Atlanta for Barnett. So you better get your ass ready because you're coming off the bench. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And if you're young and energetic and you follow this thing, you knew it was going to be your turn. So you didn't get this frustrated where you're saying, these guys are never going to let me get a shot at it. You know what I mean?
He popularized, at least in Florida, the package show, as Watts
Yes.
would call it, and which would be a pay-per-view.
Right.
Because it was the big show. Florida towns were smaller in terms of population,
Right.
and they were there every week. So they, instead of just relying on one main event, there'd be one clear main event. Here's
Right.
what's supposed to draw the money, whether it's Dusty and Pac Song or Brisco and Funk or whatever. But up and down the show, there would be different types of matches with different stipulations for different titles or different rewards for the winner. And everybody had a little issue because that way, that was the package show, and the big ones started becoming the super cards where they'd open up the Bayfront Center in St. Petersburg.
Right.
And they had 12,000 seats
Right.
to fill in a weekly town. So they had to really, jack it up a little bit. But Watts took that philosophy and went to the Superdome, and Dusty took it and made Starrcade.
Right.
And now it'd be called a pay-per-view, but that didn't exist back in those days. But when you talk about famous angles, in Florida, the first one that everybody talks about that got the whole thing off the ground was Eddie Graham, Boris Malenko, and
Right.
false teeth.
Right.
What did you hear about that? Because that was the mid-'60s. You obviously weren't around it.
No,
But was that like one of those things like in Louisville, everybody talks about the scaffold match with Jerry Jarrett and Don Green, even though they were 5 years old when it happened?
Yeah.
If everybody was there in Louisville that claims to have been there, it would have sold out Freedom Hall, 20,000 seats.
Yeah.
But it's legendary. Everybody remembers Eddie Graham on television stomping
Stomping
Boris
his-
Malenko's false teeth,
Right.
and they sold out, I guess, for weeks and weeks and weeks afterwards. But were they still talking about it then?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even in the business when they did that. And then I came in and I met Boris for the first time, and then I heard about it. And like you said, everywhere I went, now Boris was a babyface. Everybody would say to me, "Oh, I used to hate that Malenko. I really liked it when Eddie bust
Yeah.
his teeth." And like you said, here's an 8-year-old kid telling me this. He couldn't have possibly seen it. So, yeah,
And it sounds so hokey, really. Okay,
Yeah.
the babyface stomped the heel's false teeth, but the way that they did it, and then Malenko crusaded trying to get Graham to pay for the teeth,
Yeah.
and was trying to get him suspended or whatever. But they made it seem legitimate. And think about if somebody really did knock your false teeth out of your mouth and stomp on him, you'd probably be mad. That'd be a reason to fight. But the next thing that everybody remembers or thinks of Florida about was probably a little more serious. That was, they took it all over the country, but Jack Brisco and Dory Funk Jr.
Right.
It was for 1969 to 73. It was the Flair and Steamboat of that time.
Right.
It was the gold standard in the ring. The two best in the world at what they did. Was Eddie Graham, because it's no secret that the Brisco family and the Funk family had some enmity, was the word. There was a little tension there.
Right.
Is there heat? I can feel it. It's not scalding, but it's there. Austin Idol.
Yeah.
Eddie Graham, Jack Brisco was his protege.
Right.
At the same time, Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk were like extended members of the family because he had worked for their father and their father had taught him. So he was the one that could get in there and get the best out of both of them. And still to this day, I guess that the 1 hour show, which still exists on tape, I've got a copy of Jack and Dory sitting down with Eddie Graham and Gordon Soley and discussing their 1 hour draw in St. Petersburg.
Right.
You watch that and you think this was a legitimate sporting contest between two wrestlers that just happened to be professionals instead of amateurs, and they were serious about it.
Yeah.
And they drew money in every NWA territory in the country just by coming in cold sometimes, whether it be St. Louis or whatever, place they didn't even work. Main event, boom, for the title, Brisco Funk, and they drew money. That was Eddie Graham's, even though he didn't wrestle like that as a wrestler, and I'm droning on here now. He was a brawler, he was a fighter, threw the great right punch, but he loved that kind of wrestling, and that's what he presented really the best, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when you just said that to me, you know, Brisco and Funk, it's Ali and Frazier.
Yeah.
They both needed each other, you know what I mean? And the interesting thing about that thing you saw, the hour Broadway, they came back 2 months later and went 90 minutes. And, you know, in Florida, you didn't have to stay and watch the matches. But when Brisco and Funk came in, everybody stayed.
Yeah, everybody
you know what I
did,
mean?
yeah.
And it was the most legitimate feel I ever saw in my life to any wrestling match. And I'm not diminishing Steamboat and Flair at all, but it was a different thing. You know, you still had Rick being Rick. This was an athletic contest between Florida and Texas.
And also, to be honest, to be fair to both both Ricks, Flair and Steamboat, neither one of them were an NCAA wrestling champion. Right. So Brisco had a little leg up in working a worked, legitimate contest, and Dory, because of his training and his father and etc., you know, he was one of the guys that could hang.
Well, I'm sure you know this, Jimmy. They used to. This was way ahead of its time, okay? And I used to think, where are they going to take this, you know? And they kind of didn't go anywhere. But they would have the Funks against the Briscoes in Florida in a tag match, right? And they would send that tape back, and they would re-audio the tape. So the Funks were baby faces in Amarillo.
In Amarillo, yeah.
And they would send it back the other way. Then they would do it in Amarillo and send it back with the, you know, Funks were heels. And they did a thing one time that was, you know, we talked about subtle things. Do you remember the angle with the father mistakenly hitting the bell?
Yes, but what were the details? What were the details?
The things was, it was for Dory's belt.
Yeah.
And Jack went in for the figure four, but it was about 58 minutes. And, you know, supposedly Senior's getting excited, and he goes over by mistake. He hits the big gong, right? Like the gong, gong, referee calls it off, right? And then they had the guy make him believe it was Stanley Blackburn, right?
Yeah.
He's saying, no, there's 2 minutes left, Junior rolls out of the ring, limping around.
And Dory Senior's like, oh, I didn't mean to hit that. Yeah.
And I mean, that little thing, you know, then Eddie came, made a promo, and they had a thing from Telegram, you know, back in those days, telegrams were big. Sam Mushnick, we're looking into this. We're going to ban Funk Sr. from ever being at ringside in any arena in the United States. And in fact, next week, we've banned Terry Funk for being on a card with Brisco and Funk, right? I mean, Dory and Jack. So right away you're thinking, oh, the belt's going to change now. They're not in here, right? And that's how they got into the 60 Minutes.
Well, and then, to be honest, nobody knows yet, and Eddie Graham was in the middle of that when Dory was supposed to drop the belt to Jack, and then word came from Texas that Dory had had a truck wreck on the ranch, herding some cattle, turned over in a gully, and they sent pictures of him in the hospital, in the sling, etc. That's kind of what started the issue with the Brisco family, because he don't want to put me over.
Right.
And then just to make sure, when they got Dory back in the ring, that's why it went from Dory to Harley, and then Harley to Jack. Eddie had to be in the middle of that, and there's Jack is his hometown boy, his homemade protege.
He was bullshit.
Was he?
He was absolutely bullshit. And I can remember him saying, again, this is when I was really close to him, I heard him yelling, and very seldom did Eddie yell, I heard him yelling at the phone to Mushnick, "This is bullshit. This is bullshit." And he said to him, everybody thinks it was because Old Man Funk didn't want Dory to lose to a babyface. You know that, right?
Yeah.
That's what everybody thinks.
It had to be a heel, right? That was the story. It had to be a heel. But.
He didn't want to lose to that he wasn't the best wrestler.
Yeah.
Okay. But there's a little bit more to this story. And you'll be the guy to find out. At that time, they started booking opposition in Japan, the Funks. Remember? They went. That's when they went to New Japan.
That's right, because
here's what they wanted to do. They wanted to send Dory over there to defend the belt because they wanted to have a tournament for the belt. Do you remember that? They were going to have a tournament.
Yes.
They were going to have a tournament, and Holly was going to win, or Jack was going to win. It didn't matter. Or for Old Man Funk, whoever won the tournament was champion. But Junior was going to go over there as the undefeated NWA champion and give them credibility, even though at that time Inoki wasn't in.
And that's where he ended up going, because they had an hour draw, Dory and Inoki at some point, 73 or whatever, and that's on one of those compilation tapes.
Yeah. So there was more to it than just that, and this was like.
And that Eddie Graham would have not let anything happen to the NWA relationship with Giant Baba.
Right.
So, okay.
And that's where I think that sometimes there's always more to the story, like Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. It wasn't just losing in the tournament. Because if you look at it, really, if you look at it on paper, what a house you draw, right? With the one-night tournament with Brisco, Terry, Harley. You could throw anybody in there at that time, too. Kaniski, Thez could come out of retirement. You could throw. You're going to sell out. It wasn't so much that, I don't think, that Eddie saw. He saw them taking the belt that Jack's going to have, even though it isn't around his waist.
The lineage.
Yeah, and it wasn't around his waist, but he's the undefeated NWA champion. Now you give him legitimacy to Inoki. Now Baba's going to be pissed, right?
Yeah.
Now they're trying to, so.
It was the following year. Again, that was 73, title changes. So it was 74. If you got to talk about one Florida angle,
right,
it's the American Dream. It's Dusty, Gary Hart, Pac Song, which started in an angle with Jack Brisco, and I'm going to start it and then let you take it from there, because you were there. But wasn't it the situation where Eddie, they always say, let the people call it. Let the people want to be a guy to turn babyface, or want something to happen before you do it and then do it. Well, Eddie was so smart that he was able to see Dusty and see the charisma he had and put him in a position where the people on their own would start calling for it. And then he gave him the finish earlier, right? He gave him his finish, and it was their own idea. It was the people's idea for Dusty Rhodes to be a babyface, because he led them down that path. And part of it was Dusty able to last with Jack Brisco.
Right.
And then Gary Hart's got upset about it. And how did they go into the thing from there, and what do you remember about it?
Okay. Now, the only time I've ever, it was not like Dusty's, but you remember when Steiner turned babyface, the people wanted him to be babyface, okay? It got to be that everything that Eddie orchestrated was, like you said, the people demanding him to be babyface. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. But now he goes through with Jack Brisco on TV. They did that thing on TV.
That's
remember?
right, time limit draw.
He goes to the time limit draw with the Golden Child, right? And then Gary gets involved in it. You know what I'm saying? That was Gary pushing him around. And then Mike came out, and Dusty saved Mike because Pac Song went to go to do the chop, and Dusty jumped in front of Mike, and Pac Song
sacrificed himself.
You got it. You got it. Yeah.
Dusty loved that too. He used that spot for years afterwards. I loved it.
And you know what was crazy about it? You know, we all know Dust, right? And I love him. But you know the stories they'll tell you about people hawking tickets, scalping tickets in Miami and every place around? That was true. I saw it. Everything was sold out. This is 74, right?
Yep.
This is 74. I saw people selling tickets for $200, buying tickets in 74. He was so over. I mean, he was like a rock star. But he had, you know, I always mention, you know, there's only a few great managers. Of course, you're one of them, and Gary.
Gary was fantastic.
Gary was fantastic.
And with the Foreign Menace, Pac Song Nam, the evil Pac Song Nam.
We're just leaving Vietnam with our ass kicked,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
now they were hot.
Big national embarrassment. Here's
Yeah.
this giant
Pac Song Nam.
Vietnamese with the glandular disease and
Yeah.
the huge face. And that's what Dusty didn't fit in with Gary's guys also, because Gary had the Pac Songs and the Kabukis and the Foreign Menaces
Right.
and the real bad guys. And then here come Dusty Rhodes, Yavin, and the psychedelic superstar, baby.
Yeah.
And it didn't fit anyway. And Dusty was also none of Gary's guys usually did their own talking.
Yeah.
And then Dusty comes and starts doing the promo, so it was almost made he doesn't fit. And the people are screaming, this doesn't fit, this doesn't fit.
He's the American Dream, and he's tag team partners with a Vietnamese guy. But the thing about Pac Song that everybody forgets, I'm sure you've seen the tapes, Jimmy. You know, we've seen guys like Toru Tanaka break the bricks.
Yeah.
He was breaking stones. He was a legit deal. You know, like a river stone,
Yeah.
he'd break that in half. So people bought in that he was Pac Song Nam, you know what I mean? And that angle, actually that angle ended my run, because Mike went with Dusty, and I went off into New York. You know what I mean?
And you went.
Yeah, and I went.
But now, and I know so much of it was Dusty's, and T.C. Lee, the ditch digger that he worked with. That T.C. Lee was a real person, at least Dusty says, and his father really was a plumber. But the promos were Dusty's, but how much of the guidance and the direction was Eddie? How much of him was saying, "Okay, son, you can talk, but here's what you need to say"? Or did he just open the door for him and let him just...
Well, he opened the door for him and let him just do it.
Yeah.
But if Eddie wanted something specifically in there, he would give him guidelines. You know what I mean? He'd say, okay, everything he's doing is right on. But is there a way you can, without coming out and overtly saying this, can you say that you're not going to pull out like we did in Vietnam? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
He'd
yeah,
let
yeah.
him think that. You know, so he gave Dusty something to think about. But I mean, you know, it was such, I mean, I can remember when he turned, okay? And the first time him and Mike were on TV, they did a Pac Song, and they were gonna wrestle on TV, right?
Yeah.
And they went off the air immediately. I was downtown in Tampa, and you could hear the television stations like it was someone preaching on the radio. Gordon Soley's voice was all over. I mean, I was going, what the hell is this? I mean, that was such, I don't think, you know, in my life I ever saw that intensity of anything. I mean, it boomed. I mean, it was, okay, well, they were doing big money, but now they're scalping tickets. You know what I mean? And one turn.
And even Dusty and all great men and great performers do have egos, but even Dusty wasn't about to say, no, Eddie, I don't think I ought to do that. It's not right for me, baby. No, he was going to do whatever.
Yeah.
And I had friends, you know, because that's just at that point in time when I was really starting trade programs and magazines and things back and forth. And I had friends in Florida say, "You've never seen anything like this. You've never seen anything like this." And finally, then I would travel, and I got to see him on TBS. On the cable show in like '76, and he's doing the promo and wearing the outfits. I'm like, this is insane, because it doesn't look like it should work, but it works perfect.
Well, I'll show you how Eddie was so on top of things. Remember I told you about 5 minutes ago about the bet with Vince?
Yeah.
He didn't want Vince to flop, so he suggested Superstar and Dusty in the bull rope. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He
because the cards underneath Backlund were always
Jimmy
stacked.
Snuka,
Bruno could have Crusher Verdue on top and nobody underneath, and it was fine. But he stacked the cards because that's the way you made sure that the perception of your main event star was that he was drawn.
Yeah.
So whether it's Andre or whether it's Bruno back for a special match or whether it's Superstar Billy Graham against Dusty Rhodes. Well, you told me one time, Eddie Graham would call Vince McMahon Sr. and say, "Can you take Dusty for just, for a couple weeks? I got to get somebody else over down here."
Yeah.
And you couldn't get anybody else over as long as Dusty Rhodes was still there. Nobody could get over Dusty.
Well, Terry and I have talked about this too. Terry would say to me, Eddie would have to get Dusty out of there. I mean, he just had it because it was a logjam. You know what I mean? No one was going around them, and no one was going to replace him, and he knew that. But he'd send them up to Barnett when Barnett started running, Columbus and Michigan and all that. Right. But all the time he was doing that, he was also going to Houston. He was going to St. Louis. He was going up to Vince. And then Eddie would try to get some guys over, and they would do fairly well, you know. But the people would clamor for Dusty to come back, you know what I mean? And as soon as he came back...
But that's the thing, they were clamoring for him to come back. How can I miss you if you won't go away? And it's just, in those days, you had a place to send guys so you could protect your investment.
Right.
So, well, he's getting a little stale over here, even though Dusty, it was hard to get stale at that time. But any regular talent. Get a little stale over here, but if I send him to X for a few weeks or a few months, and he comes back, and rock and roll leaves Louisiana, comes back Tennessee for 90 days, goes back. Oh, they're so happy. During these hot periods like this in the 70s, and even late 70s, early 80s was hot, what was the money like for the top guys? In the state of Florida, home almost every night if you wanted to be, sun, fun, beaches, weather.
JJ and I talked about this in the early 80s in Florida. The guys... I'm sure when Dusty did this in '74, he was making $150,000. In the '80s, you were making $100,000 if you were working with Dusty.
Yeah.
And
1974, that's 40 years ago.
Right.
$150,000 for those guys figured into that thing. That would be $500,000 now, probably.
At least,
as they say, as the kids say these days, today's money.
Yeah.
And in one state. And I mean, of course, now, like Dusty at that point in the mid-'70s when he started going to Atlanta and he started going to other places, he wasn't making quite as much from Florida, but he was making more because he was starting to cherry pick his shots.
Yep.
Ole Anderson, talked to him in Charlotte last year, booking the Carolinas and being a booker and a top talent in Atlanta. Also at the same time, he was making $250,000 a year in the late 70s.
Right.
And I think, a lot of the guys these days, that's what they would aspire to now in 2015, but they think that Vince created big money in wrestling. The big money for the majority of people in wrestling was actually before
Absolutely.
Vince McMahon got his hands on it.
Well, Jimmy, I want to just throw something out at you. I read this just, after I read your book, I read some excerpts from Thez's book, right? When he went to wrestle Ricky Dozan, he went for 6 weeks, 12 matches, back in '53. Dozan paid him $300,000. And I read Lou's, you may have seen, there's a YouTube clip where he's running on the beach where he had that hotel, and right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And if you watch him when he's running on the beach, he's saying, I'm working about 2 days a week now. I've cut back. I'm making $5,000 a week on a bad week. These guys just make huge money.
Well, in Chicago, the Dumont Network Television, and we're going to cover that in another edition of Back to the Territories, but The U.S. champion, Vern Gagne,
Right.
who was made by Fred Kohler, who ran the Chicago TV, was the only other touring champion besides Thez in the NWA title. He got the same deal. Instead of the NWA and Thez, it was Gagne got 10% of the house.
Wow.
And Kohler got 3% for the booking fee instead of Barnett for the NWA.
Yeah.
So the point is, even at $2 and $3 tickets, when he was going to buildings that were drawing 5 and 6 and 8 and 10,000 people, whether it be Chicago or Milwaukee or wherever, that's $1,500, $2,000 a day on some of these shows. Point is, the top 5 money-earning athletes in the United States, pro athletes in the early 50s, were the world heavyweight boxing champion and 4 pro wrestlers. Gorgeous George, Vern Gagne, Lou Thez, and somebody else, the TV stars.
Yeah.
The team sports didn't even compare. So anyway, going back to the original question, long story short, too late. Guys were making 6 figures, working in the state of Florida in the 70s and in the 80s. And that also was helpful for their career because they knew, as well, get proteges. Eddie Graham had so many proteges. Jack Brisco, Bill Watts, Dusty Rhodes, yourself. Brisco, he knew as an NCAA champion, was going to be an All-American boy from Oklahoma, great amateur wrestler, clean cut, good look. He groomed him, and it included sending him out to Amarillo so he could do jobs for Dory and Terry, which led to some lasting issues. Bill Watts was a protege in terms of he had already been in the business for 10 years, but he learned to book there.
Right.
Dusty was a protege in that he and Dick Murdoch had already been main event guys as the Texas Outlaws, and he already kind of had a clue what he was doing with his deal, but he was shaped in Florida and then made so hot that they were scalping tickets and he was shitting on Jackie Gleason's toilet.
Yeah.
Yourself, who had been in the business in a variety of positions as talent, but actually got a chance to sit in and listen to these things and book and matchmake. He had so much impact on some. Can you think of other people that sat under that learning tree? I mean, everybody that ever worked there, but specifically.
I'll tell you one that if he didn't have an accident, Jimmy, we'd be talking about him being the smartest.
Bobby Shane?
Bobby Shane, by far. He just had it. And the other one was Dickie Slater. You know, when he was in that real bad wreck and he hit his head.
Car wreck, okay, yeah.
He never was the same. I mean, it did something to him, okay?
Had he just watched a videotape of Terry Funk and then he had the car wreck and when he woke up he thought he was Terry?
Yeah, I think so. But I'm telling you, he knew how to work the day he came into the business. He knew how to manipulate. He knew how to do angles. He was a big, burly guy, and he would get the baby face over before he ever threw a punch, you know what I mean? And when he kicked it in gear, the only guy I ever saw do the similar thing to him, kick it in gear and take it to a different level, Paul Orndorff.
Yeah.
Everybody
exactly
from Florida that made it, really made it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they got to see all this great talent, and they got to see it in a different way.
Orndorff, when Orndorff was a rookie, Eddie sent him up to Memphis to work for Jerry Jarrett. And they put the belt, Lawler worked with him. Lawler could work with anybody, whether they had a match or not. And they put the belt on him there for a brief time as his first title. But they showed the footage of Orndorff and Bob Backlund working out in the gym, where they did that thing where they did the back bridge, but their legs were entwined, and then they were doing sit-ups with it. And it looked like inhuman shit. And these guys are real athletes. Holy shit. 2 weeks of that, and Paul Orndorff was made by the time he got in the ring, and then they put him over David Schultz and some underneath heels. 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, and 4 weeks later he's Lawler for the title. Boom, one punch, knockout. Boom, wins the belt, and all of a sudden he's over in a month.
Yeah.
And you know, that's those guys. He had such great raw material, such clay to work with.
Yeah, and you know, you said something that just jumped out at me. They were all athletes. Slater could have played. He could have played for the Miami Dolphins.
Yeah,
but
he was a hot-shot football player.
Yeah, and he was a very good amateur wrestler. Paul Orndorff, I mean, he went to the pros, football. Yeah. I mean, you look at it, Jack Brisco, Gerald Brisco, I mean, the basics, the funks, you know what I mean? They all brought legitimacy to the business, especially that's what Eddie wanted. And I find it very ironic all these guys that were buff and national champions and all that, it ended up with Dusty being the biggest one. Maybe because it was
He was different.
Yeah.
If you got a ring full of 7-foot guys, you haven't got any giants.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We talked about Eddie's influence on the NWA and on the other promoters. He had not only a vote, but one of the votes on the world title, right?
Right.
We talked about the fact that people would call him not only for finishes, but to settle disputes. If there was a fight between two other promoters, everybody wanted to know what Eddie said. We talked about the Jarrett and Goulas thing, the relationship with Vince Sr. So there was that. You know how I figured out there was some kind of something going on between Florida and the WWF? I was a big newspaper clipping trader, right? See what the lineups were. And I discovered that the layouts of some of the Florida ads were the exact same pattern as the layout of some of the WWF ads all the way up. I'm like, there's something going on here.
With the picture of Bruno. And
Exactly. Just
Cowboy,
different names, but the same, you know. Was it just something that there had never been an NWA WWF unification title match until they did them in Florida.
Right.
And Eddie Graham was able to get, one of them was Superstar Graham and Harley Race.
I was on that show.
Were you, was that when the Orange Bowl? Or was
that was the Orange Bowl.
Tell me about that. Well, holy shit, what a, a match that took 25 years to put together.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I remember about it that was different to me, okay? Eddie brought them into, the Orange Bowl was in a horrible section of town. You know, it's where they play the national...
We went there once, we did the 86 Bash there.
Okay,
it was brutal.
So
it was like another country,
Yeah, and you remember all the little enclaves and alleyways and different places you could go and get lost and not even get to the ring, you know, if you took the wrong turn. You bump into Igor, or is that Igor?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And they were actually on the street outside the stadium, like middle of the day, because we got there early. They were actually cooking some type of animal and selling it on sticks out there. It looked apparently unlicensed also, just from what I could tell. It was a strange neighborhood. Anyway.
He took Race and I thought this was funny, because he took Race and Superstar in Enclave by themselves. Nobody else was there, you know, and usually maybe Dusty would be there, or, you know, one of his guys. And the other thing that I thought was strange, here we are, and we're North Miami, right? And Vince's house is 15 minutes away, and Vince wasn't.
And he wasn't there.
Yeah. So I'm sure Eddie had gone to Vince's house, asked Vince what he wanted, and Vince said to him, well, this is what I want, Eddie. How do we get there? I'm sure they got the particulars. And I'm sure, in my head, Vince wouldn't have done it with anybody else but Eddie because of the double crosses, right?
Yeah, because that...
Yeah, it could have been...
Harley Race, Superstar Graham. I don't think there's much doubt there what's going to take place if, you know, if it had to be that way.
Yeah, and I think that Eddie was so close to Vince that Vince said, I don't even have to go, I'm sure it's going to be okay, you know what I mean? And then on the other hand, Vince was smart enough that if I go, that's a red flag, right?
Yeah.
But I saw, if you watch the tape, Superstar does a lot more wrestling than I ever saw him do. You know, and Eddie said, hey, this is prestige. You know, you're going to act like this is the real deal.
Yeah.
One of you could lose, and you could unify this belt. Because I think Eddie saw somewhere down the line, if Vincent Sr. had lived, that there could have been a huge unification match on closed, because closed circuit
at
was
the
just
time
starting, right? So I think that's what happened, and they had a very good match. And remember, they had the count out with the blood and the whole.
And they did a couple of them still in Florida, and Backlund did one also.
I wrestled Backlund on different.
Did you really?
Yeah, I wrestled Backlund for the WWF title in Atlanta twice, and I wrestled him in Miami once. But again, you know what we talked about? You know, even though that was the match, right?
Yeah.
The match under us was Dusty and Ole in a cage.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So Eddie would protect Vince
Did
is
they
in-
do WWF NWA title versus title anywhere else but Florida? Now I'm trying to think. Was there?
I think, yeah, they did. They didn't do NWA. They did AWA against WWF in Montreal.
Yeah. And they were all going to Houston at the same time
Yeah,
because
yeah,
everybody worked for Paul.
yeah,
Nick had an interest,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you know, et cetera.
And I think they might have had the AWA champion against the WWF champion in Houston.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was maybe it was Nick and Harley. Anyway, regardless.
Right.
Moving on.
Yes.
We talked about the style and the image of the promotion. It was a mix of scientific wrestlers and chaos, but it was all logical and credible, and it fit the presentation. Do you think that I guess a loaded question, do you think either would have worked without the other? Maybe I'm answering my own question. Do you think just all scientific wrestling wouldn't have worked and all brawling would have got old real quick? That's how he was able to keep it different, because if he had a brawl at the top of the card, it would be scientific underneath, and if he had a wrestling match, they'd do a little more fighting, but it managed to complement each other. Now they have hardcore promotions, they have a lucha promotion, they have a wrestling promotion, they have a sports entertainment promotion, and we're just whacking up the same size pie in smaller pieces. But then he was able to please everybody. Is it just because of difference in fans and wrestlers? Or?
No, I think that he saw, he used to say to me, you know, we know each other forever, Jimmy, you know, and sometimes I'll paint off the easel, you know, cut off my hair, Van Gogh. He would say to me, and this is when I was booking there too, he'd say to me, we're going to have scorched earth and nothing will grow. That was his cue to me to pull it in, you know, a little bit more wrestling, Kevin. Don't
Scorched
get so
earth and nothing will grow.
Yeah.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And once you've burned it, you burn it.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you brought up early in the interview was where he came from. He came from Amarillo in Texas, and that was the wrestling, right?
Yeah.
Wrestling from Texas, right? Was that
Wild and woolly, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Then he went up to New York, where there was a little bit more wrestling, but him and Dr. Jerry were causing riots all over the place.
Yeah.
And then he saw, well, you can only go so far, and now if I own the territory, I don't want to get sued for all this stuff, so let's bring it back just a little, you know what I mean?
Just a drama.
Just bring it back a little. And okay, we got King Curtis and Mark coming in. Okay, 6 months, and we'll let them go back to Australia. But let's be prepared when they go that, sift it out, put a handle on it, make sure they don't burn, everything up. He just had
Stop the blood for a little while.
Yeah, he just had it. Oh, yeah. When Curtis and Lewin left, there was no blood for a while. You know what I mean?
Because why? Why
Yeah,
would you,
yeah, Yeah, and he just had this ungodly feel to the business. I think, Jimmy, he started very young, 15 or 16?
Yeah.
I think when you're that so deep in it, that was his only relief was the wrestling business. You know what I mean? He was so absorbed with it that I'm sure that I could love to have been in a bunch of conversations with him and Terry and him and Dory Sr. They must have been some great conversations, you know what I mean? But those guys, wrestling was their life, you know what I mean? It was so deep.
When did you take the book first time?
The first time was when I said back in '74, he let me and Dickie have the Fort Myers. And then the first time I took the book was in about '82, I became Dusty's assistant. Then in '85, I took the book until Jimmy bought it out.
Well, the '80s, there were changes, there were fresher talent, but still you had Dusty, obviously, but Barry Windham come along. David Von Erich, they sent David over there, and that's where he got a chance to be a heel, and they were grooming him, for the NWA title. He was going to go to Florida, be a heel, then he was already in St. Louis, and then
Was the Missouri champion, which we talked about. Yeah.
You were still there, but now you'd gone from a smiling and happy baby face to an evil person who bore no resemblance to the.
Yeah.
Wahoo McDaniel, Lex Luger popped up right there just at the last. Dory was still around. Mike Rotunda and Wyndham were a good team. Ron Bass and Black Bart. The Young Bloods, the Zambui Express, one of my favorite tag teams, not necessarily for match quality, but just for name and sheer gross poundage. The early 80s were still hot, though, and I remember, once again, the Funks and Briscoes had a nice little program on TV down there, and you know, the names were changing, but Florida wrestling still had cachet in the community, as they say. When you first, I remember Dutch told me he booked Florida, I guess.
Right after me.
Right after you and after Eddie had died, and he said, hell, he said, I could have done better, but they didn't tell me when I was booking these big shows, they didn't tell me I could just say we could raise the ticket prices whenever we, the championship prices. He didn't know that.
Yeah.
He said Dusty told him one time, what, kid, just raise the prices.
Yeah.
Well, fuck, I didn't know I could do that, Dream. What did you, when you first got the book the first time of the whole territory, what did you find out, what did you learn that you had not known that you didn't know up until that point?
Well, I think what I learned that I didn't know was, and I don't know why I didn't, because I was there when it started, was how powerful TBS was. You know what I mean? Because I didn't have cable at that time, and I saw how to see an encroachment on it was Tommy Rich. That was the first. Yeah. And then they sent me up there to go on a tour because they wanted you to get your face to coming back into Florida. So I went on a tour, and it was the first tour they went on to Columbus, Ohio. Tommy Rich was like the Beatles. The girls were throwing their underwear in the ring. You know what I mean? It was like, whoa, they were sold out. They popped when the guys locked up for the first time. So I started to say, wow.
And they hadn't seen live wrestling up there since the Sheik had folded up, 5-6 years before. So it was like they used to say, a virgin crowd again, which is another thing we can't ever find is a virgin crowd anymore. They've all been deflowered. Very brutal fashion.
But I saw that, the only way to stop this machine being, and it was, again, 6:05 to 8:05, what a time slot, right? Because on the East Coast, you're going out on a Saturday night, you sat down, you had a beer, you're watching this, wait, oh, gee, I'm going to go, I will be waiting there, let's watch this, that kind of thing. The only way they could have, and was the time they went to Memphis and were doing those, try to do that
didn't work.
No. Because of all the egos, you know that, right?
Well, we were at the Great American Bash '86. That's the one I remember was the worst. There was a couple of stinkers, a couple of great ones, a couple of stinkers, but the worst one was Memphis. We're at the Liberty Bowl Stadium, next door to the Mid-South Coliseum. It seats 11,000. Yeah. Liberty Bowl seats 70,000, and I think we had 2,000 people.
Yeah.
Because Jerry Lawler wasn't on the card.
Right.
And Lance Russell didn't tell us about it on TV Saturday morning. So people in Memphis weren't buying it. Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, we don't give a shit.
Right.
Could be a second coming of Luthez and Frank Gotch.
Right.
But at the period of the early '80s, that's with all the changes everybody knows about, Vince starting to expand just at that point, the people starting to get a glimmer of smartness, then the promoters helping them along quite a bit later on. Business stayed up for a while there, but it started. Was that what? And I hate to get into the morbid stuff, but Eddie's death obviously was sudden and somewhat controversial, and you've told me a few stories about it, but the wrestling business his business was still fairly solid.
His business was fairly solid, and he got into, a land problem that they had. The story I got from a pretty reliable source was Mike. They bought some property, and they were going to put a loop around Tampa, on I-4. I think it's 204, 240 now. Well, someone in the county gave them the specifics where it was going to happen, okay? Eddie put the money up, and the guy that was his partner was a crook, and it was nothing but a scam. They had the people in the commission scam Eddie. And, you know, he could have faced some jail time. And I think, you know, there's been all kinds of surmising what happened, but I think I saw him from going, he was sober for 17 years. I was there, he shotgunned a beer. I went, whoa, you know, it was right off the cliff. And I think that whatever haunted him, we'll never know, Jimmy.
Yeah.
But the thing that I always remember, Florida was the last place that Vince Jr. invaded. He didn't go to Florida until...
You're right.
Yeah.
Probably till after Eddie was dead at that point.
Yeah, he didn't go. And
do you think even Vince said, well, my dad would roll over in his grave if I try to fuck Eddie?
You know, I kind of think that it was like, yeah, he might have thought that, but he was going to go eventually. But I think he was going to do it where he was thinking, because of my dad's relationship with Eddie, maybe he'll have no access to talent. Things will go wrong, and I can buy him out like I bought the Calgary out.
Yeah.
Those different territories. I think that's what he would have done because, you know, Eddie was so well connected. It wouldn't take Eddie but a phone call to stop a show. You know what I mean?
See, that was the one thing that Vince, the people forget that it took him. He never got the Carolinas. He never got the Carolinas till Crockett folded up. He couldn't draw in the Carolinas at all. People didn't view that as wrestling, and then it took TBS killing the Carolinas wrestling, and then Vince came in, you know, in the late '90s in the Attitude Era, but that had been years.
Right.
He never drew a house in Greensboro from 1984 to 1999. Mid-South territory was incredibly difficult because people there were like, no, Mid-South wrestling is what wrestling is.
Right.
And Florida would have probably been and Memphis had its own thing, but he did well in Louisville. It was just the city of Memphis, not the whole territory that kind of rejected it. But Florida would have been, with Eddie Graham still around, would that have been the toughest nut to crack?
Yeah, I think it would have been because of how Eddie structured his whole business and his political connections. He could call somebody up and say, hey, I don't think they have a license for this, this, and this, you know.
Yeah.
We'll shut you down until you prove it to us.
And he was in every major arena in the state at that point in time, almost every week, or the big events, you know, monthly or whatever, so he would have had relationships with every building manager.
And I wonder, this is something that I've thought about, I don't have the answer. Don't you think that he had the clause, you know, a month before you couldn't run or a month after me?
Yeah.
Or, you know, I mean, so I think...
Or a day with a Y in it or whatever.
Yeah.
So the land issue, some people had said, well, Eddie flew the plane and he flew to the Bahamas a lot, but that, you know, I think now we're getting into 9/11 was an inside job and et cetera. But how did you hear about explain to the people what happened and how did you hear about it?
Well, I was in San Antonio, and it was Super Bowl Sunday. And Mike was at the game in Los Angeles. And this is crazy. There was a snowstorm in San Antonio. And the town was, I went down there for Luke Williams. Right?
Yeah.
Luke brought me in.
Oh, the San Antonio Blanchard's office.
Yeah. So Luke brought me in. Luke was always
snows there once every 20 years.
Yeah. So we locked in, and this guy I knew from Tampa called me, and he said, "It's been on the news. Did you hear the news?" I said, "What?" He said, "Eddie's dead." I said, "What?" You know, I couldn't believe it. And he said, "Eddie's died, and they think it's a apparent gunshot wound." Mike. They sent a PA announcement at the Super Bowl. Mike Graham, please come to the office.
Oh, that's right. He was at the Super Bowl.
He thought it was a rib, and he went there, and he got on the plane. So, I mean, it was, for him, Mike, it was like, he was blindsided by it, you know what I'm saying? But in some recourse, when I look back, you know, sometimes you don't pay attention, and you see things coming, and you say, gee, how did I miss that one? He got really, really out of sorts for Eddie. You know what I mean? His beard, he didn't shave for 3 or 4 days. You know what I mean? He wasn't using his boat. Eddie always had the blonde hair. It was streaked with gray, and he just wasn't himself. And I think that whatever it was, whether it was the 9/11 theory, which could be possible, or the land, or whatever, I think whatever he was bearing, he snapped. You know what I mean? He just couldn't take it anymore.
Your transformation to, and by the way, explain, you never worshipped the devil.
No, and I never said...
Explain this.
Okay.
Explain this for people. And that came right at, was it right before Eddie was gone or right afterward? What did he think about it? The point is, if you started it right at that point. Explain what it was and then tell what.
When I started it, the angle was, I came back, and I was a babyface. And Mike had me come back with open arms. But Barry Windham and Blackjack said, this ain't the same guy that left here, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
3 years ago. This guy's no good. We've known him all along. And I'm saying, hey, we all must make mistakes, blah, 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 blah. As I'm doing these interviews and Mike's sticking up for me and they want to hang me with the dressing room split half and half, I started watching MTV, right? Horror movies the genre was in, right? Billy Idol. So I said, I should be able to take something out of this. And I had just come back with Mark from Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong. I went to the cave temples in Malaysia, and I talked to some of these people that are called Sifus, you know, the learned ones, and they tell me about this fertility god, Abuddin. I said, I never heard of that. And then we go to India and they're chewing the betel nut and all this. So everything I said was taken off a Hindu's religion. Yeah. Right? And the betel nut is what they partake in over there. And everything was going along fine until Abner put on, without no disclaimer from me, the devil is my manager. That's all they had to see in the Deep South, right? Yeah. So I was hung, you know, at that time. I was hung. And at that time, if you remember, you know, when MTV first came out too, with all these videos, they were kind of dark and kind of that way, you know what I mean? So I just jumped on the bandwagon and went with it. But Eddie at first said to me, you better be careful with this. That's all I care, you know, I care. Just be careful with this. And I knew he critiqued my interviews, you know what I mean? I never used that word, devil, I never said anything. And what happened was, you know, Dusty got into that. The devil himself.
The devil made me do it, baby.
Yeah, then he got into that, and then it became boom, you know, being Mark. And it didn't help me to say, oh, I'm not doing this, when Mark is rolling his eyes and yeesh, yeesh, you know, and he crosses his leg, the third eye, and we're talking about feasting and rejoicing. And the other thing was, because we're going the other way, we're not wrestlers, right? We're this nuts of crazy bests. We went everywhere with our robes on. I would go grocery shopping with my robe on. I went to the gym one time.
Now, this wasn't a wrestling robe. You looked like one of the druids that accompanies the Undertaker out to,
Yeah, so Mark would wear his purple one. And I went into the gym one day because there were some people talking about wrestling. You know, they say, me and Mark used to train together. And Mark overheard them saying, Mark can talk, see, Hayes can talk. They're not wacky. Mark says, you got to do something tomorrow. He said, we'll go in separate. I said, what do you want me to do? He said, you come up with it. So it was Rick Poston's gym, the one that Scott Hall always talks about, that he was trying to be a wrestler.
Yeah.
I walk in there, Mark's in there, and I got my robe on, and I don't have shoes, and I say, who is following me for the summer? We're going to the burning sands. We're toughing our feet up. The people looked at me, and they went, whoa, let's go to the bathroom, you know what I mean? So Me and Mark would be driving down the road. This got to be such a kick, too. We'd be driving down the road. Mark would have the light on. We'd be drinking beer. We'd be coming up that Yeehaw Junction 3 times a week, right?
Yeah.
First time it happens, pulls us over. Marky jumps on. Thank you for protecting us. Good. I was speeding, wasn't I? Cop was blown away, right? Marky says, thank you, officer, thank you. Every week we come by, 3 times a week, the cop would stop us. What are you guys doing? Eventually, Mark would say to him, hey, you want a beer? Well, I'm not supposed to. He said, who's going to know? You think I'm going to tell you? Yeah, we got a cop drinking the beer on the side of the road, and we're in a black robe and a purple robe. Well, that must have looked good to the people going by, huh?
Well, you had all kinds of weirdos following you guys around, too.
Oh.
But what was the story the one time with they
Van.
Yes, the van that burned the van.
Here's the thing. Outside of Orlando, there's a town called Casadega. It's mediums, people that believe in Whitaker, you know, the natural...
Psychics, card readers.
You got it.
Just,
It's a
the
carnival.
paranormal.
Yeah, paranormal. Well, Orlando was good old boys. You know what I mean? They were cowboys. They came, Mulligan and Dusty could talk them into the building. Mulligan used to say, get Mama from the kitchen, I need help. I went by, the car, smoke was billowing out of it, pantyhose, I don't know what's going on in there. So these people from Casadega started coming to the matches and cheering me and Mark, right? There was about 5 guys. And they come in a van and they gave me these elaborate set of bones, you know, that were varnished and stuff. So I said, I'm going to wear them tonight. So I wear them. These
Bones
kids,
from what type of animal?
it was a chicken.
Okay.
It was a chicken. And these kids jump up and they're, hey, get it, you know. So it's me and Marky are leaving. We see this huge fire. And we see the town folks chasing the Frankenstein monsters and beating them with boards and shit, throwing rocks at them. And I said to Mark, should we stop? He said, are you shitting me? Let's keep going. Let's get out of here.
So they burned
the van down, beat
right?
the kids up. Yeah, beat the kids up.
But they should have been carrying a snake. Where did you find all those people, those fucking snakes?
You know, I had it was crazy because, you know, Jake and I were partners first. And I carried the snake, right?
Yeah.
Before Jake. And a friend of mine, his father was High Gardner. He was the only talk show Elvis was ever on, was on that show, High Gardner.
High Gardner, yes.
Yeah, around town with High.
And H.Y.
Yeah.
High Gardner, yeah.
And his mother was Ask Marilyn in the syndicated newspapers, right? And the BBC just bought his father's old library, and they're going to do a special on him. Well, he's into snakes, so he was the first one to give me a snake. Then it's like anything else, monkey see, monkey do. At the about 2 months later, I'd go to the buildings. There'd be 12 people there with all different kinds of snakes. You know what I mean? I say, yeah. Well, I get your choice. Well, what about this one? It's albino. Okay, yeah, we'll try that one tonight.
I didn't steal the snake thing, but I did steal when you raised Mark Lewin Purple Haze from, you know, the ocean, right?
Yeah.
Well, we didn't have an ocean in Louisville, but we had the Ohio River. That's
Yeah.
good enough, right?
Yeah.
So Leviathan Batista, he comes in and he's so green. Oh my God! Alpha the Samoan had taught him how to write a check, and so we got him in class, and he was a frail demon, and he was real timid. He wanted to do what his wife told him to do, and he kind of sit around. He put his hoodie on because he had a cold all the time. I said, here's what I'd like you to do, Dave. You can take, those contact lenses you wear make your eyes look crazy, and the chain around your neck, and you got the bald head and the tattoos you already had, and we call you Leviathan, the demon of the deep, the guardian of the gates of hell. I want you to walk, and it's about 10 o'clock at night. I want you to walk about 100 feet out there in the Ohio River. You're wearing your boots, okay? Even if you swim trunks boots, you're fine. Walk out about 100 feet in the Ohio River and get down to where only the top of your head is visible. And we'll give you the Iggy and start walking this way until gradually you come out. It'll be perfect. He's never seen the footage, right? So he's like, oh my God. We get down there. There was some fishermen there, and they had a campfire, and they were just leaving, walking down the bank, and we said, do you mind if we use y'all's campfire? And they're looking, and here is the disciples of sin, Slash and Damien. The one guy's got a knife gimmick, and we've got Judas dressed up with the duster coat and the preacher, but the Bible dust comes out, and sin is throwing the fireballs, and there's Leviathan. I said, y'all aren't going to kill our dog, are you? No, your dog's fine. So we use the campfire, and she's doing the spell of making, a la Northrock, all that stuff. And here he comes. He was shitting himself. He hated it out there. He was afraid he was going to get bit by a fish or get pneumonia or whatever. But we recreated that, and that was everybody to this day goes, how in the world did you come up with that? I said, simple. I just researched Kevin Sullivan's Florida wrestling tenure. Did you get any lawsuits out of that, by the way? Because there was some heavy stuff going on.
No, I never got a lawsuit out of any of that. I mean, after a while, I got so, you know, you've talked about this before, getting stabbed.
Yeah.
There were sometimes I was saying, boy, I'm looking, you know, this one's going to be tough to get out of, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in the Bahamas where Tyree Pride was brutal. I'll tell you a quick story.
Please tell me a story about Tyree Pride in the Bahamas.
Tyree Pride used to...
Just so everybody knows, when you ran the Bahamas, it helped if you had a native Bahamian.
Yeah, but he wasn't
on the card.
Yeah.
But he wasn't. But he played that part on television.
No,
right?
he was a St. Lucia, from St. Lucia.
Ah.
But a lot of them came to the Bahamas. So there was a whole group of people from St. Lucia that would come to the Bahamas.
How big was he? What was he?
5'6", you know,
170, 60, something like that. And he's beating everybody, including Ric Flair,
Yeah.
because nobody wants to beat the guy, because it'll be another one of those Jack Veneno situations with Flair. They're going to kill me here. You win. Anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. So the thing was, that was a brutal place. The only time I ever seen Haku stagger, we used to dress in a room like this and then run to the ring, the heels, right? As Haku was coming back, they had a cinder block, and from the roof, they threw it, hit him in the head. It cracked, and he stumbled, but he got in.
Yeah.
One night, Jake was wrestling Tyree, and the heels had left, and they busted the doors down, and Jake tried to hide under a wrestling mat, and they had sticks, and they were beating him like you would a rat that had gone underneath the thing. So you can see how dangerous it is, okay? So now it's gotten worse because they're throwing shit now all the time. So they build a tunnel for us, but they build it with chain link fence. So the umbrellas are coming through.
Yeah.
So the umbrellas are coming through. So
they got us a cattle chute in Tulsa, where it was a solid wood and about 6 feet tall, and you just moo. We used to moo on the way to the ring, but they couldn't get us. They'd have to reach over, and it was harder that way. Couldn't get leverage.
Oh, so I was trying not to get killed because I had gone to the Bahamas. I actually lived there for a while. So I knew a lot of people over there, and they have a thing over there, the Bahamians, where it's my color, then really black, in the same family. You know what I mean? They're mixed blood. But my color, I'd have black in me, and I'd call myself, they call them Conky Joes, right? So I used to say, how can my people cheer this guy that's an illegal alien, and I'm a Conky Joe? I'm doing everything to save my ass, right? I'm a Conky Joe, brother. Everything good, man? I didn't do my gimmick over there, right?
Yeah.
So one night, the promoter comes to me and says, we're in a cage match. They all say it's sold to the rafters. Well, this one, they were sitting on broken glass bottles that they had put in the cement up there. You saw it, Jimmy, the broken black bottles.
Yes.
And they would sit on them, okay? So
which had to be uncomfortable.
no heel ever went over there, right? No heel ever won a match. So the promoter comes to me and says...
And that was one of those towns where if they wanted you to win, you would argue with them. No, we're not, no, we'll put them over, flat, boom, done. Let's just get out of here.
No heat.
Yeah.
Try not to get heat. So they said to me, you're in a cage match with Tyree. What if Mark comes down, the referee gets knocked down, and you guys hang him? I said, let me understand what you just said again. You want me to double team a black man and hang him in front of 99.9% St. Lucians out there? They said, yeah. I said, who's going to protect me? And the owner, the promoter, his name was Charlie Majors, and he was in the Congress there. And he had a son that was a midget about this high. He said, I'll protect you. I said, what? He said, I'll protect you and I'll have the police around me. I said, Charlie, if I do this and I walk out of that, open that door, and you're not there, I'll kill you. Because they offered me a bribe to do it. And I said, okay. Mark comes down, we hang him. I open the door, and as I straddled the ring in the railing, there's Charlie. But now there's a wave, right?
Yeah.
Charlie's got a chair, right? I grabbed Charlie and put him on my head. He got to the dress room, he was split from here. They beat him to death. The chair was boom, 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 boom. Wait, it gets better. He's bleeding, he's gonna get stitches. There's the ambulance guy there looking at him, and his son, the midget, comes in and sees his dad and goes, oh, and fell. I went right over and put the boots to him. I said, God damn it, you deserve it too. You were supposed to be out there.
You could have saved me.
Yeah, it was, I mean, but he drew so much money down there. And he also drew in Miami because there's so many people from the Caribbean in Miami, you know? Yeah.
You had so many angles where you pushed things. And actually, we had somebody write in earlier, fan mail from some flounder, to say they put a stamp on it, put it in the mailbox, whole 9 yards. The angle where you threw the ink in Dusty's sister's eyes on the This Is Your Life, Dusty Rhodes segment. Explain it and then tell what kind of feedback you got from it.
Oh, what happened was I had lost a lose-a-leave time match. Mark and I were recruited by Jimmy Crockett to go for the first Starrcade. They actually flew us up to the airport, met with us, and Mark and I were making good money. They said, we'll triple your money, blah, blah, blah. So I tell Dusty, so Dusty was the Midnight Rider then, and I lose a leave time match, but I come back in the mask, and it's me against Dusty in a cage. You know, loser is going to be unmasked. So I lose and I'm gone. I go up to Charlotte. So I'm up to Charlotte. We're not getting anything because they shut the territory down just about because they get ready for Starrcade.
Getting ready for Starrcade. They didn't want to burn everything out.
Yeah, they're doing all this TVs and not making any money. And after I got my Starrcade payoff, I said, I'm out of here. But the week I didn't get any kind of money at all to even live on, Dusty called me and said, I'd like you to come back. And I said, okay. So I wasn't in the territory where they did this. Dusty, This Is Your Life, like the old TV program. So people would come out and mention Dusty, and Dusty say, oh, that's Billy Bob Walker or whatever. Come over. So then they do this thing where it's his sister, supposedly, and she says, oh, thank you for being such a great older brother, protect me all the time. So she comes out. Now all the baby faces come out and hugging Dusty and, you know, kissing his ass. And I come in like Jack Ruby because he was signing a contract for Ric Flair. And with a big quill pen, right?
And the ceremonial pen and the inkwell. Yeah.
So I grab the ink and I throw it at Dusty. He ducks and blinds his sister. So now he's saying, I want Kevin Sullivan back, in the NWA saying, I'm suspended for 5 years or indefinitely or whatever. So they have an emergency meeting, and again, how Eddie tied things in. Yeah. 2 of them vote to keep me suspended, 2 of them vote to allow me to wrestle. The deciding vote is Eddie. Dusty does one of the best promos I ever saw him do. You know, you gotta do it for me. You gotta do. And they said, okay. So that was the thing. And then Dusty and I went to Lakeland, and the Dream did the right thing for business. My first night back, he put me over. And a lot of heat, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I beat him with, of course, an object, but the people thought, well, you know, first of all, I'm gone. Okay, I came back, I'm going to be gone again. But when I beat him, it was like a you know, jump starting the heart again. It got beaten again. And, you know, I mean, I got a lot. I was afraid some nights, you know, I'd be looking at guys and I'd say, what's in their hands, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, and you're wearing trunks. I'm wearing a suit with a thick jacket, and sometime in Louisiana, especially bulletproof vest underneath. I wasn't afraid they would shoot me, but it stops knives too. You're out there in your swimming trunks.
Yeah.
And did you get the fire from the Sheik? Throwing fire?
Absolutely.
Of course you did.
You know, I stole everything from him. If
You researched it.
Yeah.
You researched it. You know, the fireball thing, that's when Dusty had me do it with Ronnie Garvin. I didn't know what it was, right?
Right.
And so then I found out, but I knew you got it there. And remember, when you worked for me in Smoky Mountain, they had banned the flash paper. It's a magician's trick. It's a paper that is chemically treated, and when you touch it with anything that is hot enough to tick it off, then it bursts into lighter than air flame and go boom. But unless it sticks on your face, it's not really going to. Although I burned Ronnie's eyebrows off and his fucking nose hair and everything. He said, make it look good. But I had to get your paper when you'd come up to me in Knoxville, because they made it illegal in Florida because the bookies were writing the bets on the paper. And when the cops would come in, they just touch it, boom, it's gone, and there's no.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
You know, you should have tried to figure out a way to have more gimmicks. You never really had the fire and the snakes and the
and the spike, you know.
So when Eddie had died, this was January of '85, right?
Yeah.
January of '85. The territory was doing reasonably well, but what did you talk to anybody down there at the time? What did the guys think? What was, you know, in everybody's mind? Is this the end? What's going to go on? Who's going to carry the flag?
I think they thought that Dusty was going to come back.
And he was already working for Crockett.
They thought he was coming back. In fact, he kind of gave indications that he was coming back to Mike. Yeah. So they thought Dusty was going to come back. Everything was going to be okay. I was outside the territory. Mike was trying to run it by himself, and he had Hero and Duke on his shoulder every day. And so that was January. I think in like May, the Hero called me and said, we need you to come back. Yeah. So I came back, but when I came back, I knew without Eddie at the helm and making deals and talking to, you know, it was really easy for me to see, because I pick up a Tampa Tribune one day, and it's Tuesday, and there's not an ad in the paper, and there's not any kind of byline or anything. And I said, you know, without him, it's going to be tough, and it was, you know. Yeah. And then they made the deal with Crockett, to sell out to Crockett.
Yeah, that was less than 2 years later.
Then he sent, you know, I'm not knocking anybody, but they were green kids, right? And they've had seen who you said had been there.
And that's the midnight I first went down to Florida at that point. We had made maybe a shot or two when they did some co-promotions, but I never got to work for Eddie Graham, never got to meet Eddie Graham. Really? He was at Jerry Jarrett's housewarming. 6 weeks before I became a manager, I'm just there taking pictures, and I see Eddie Graham, and Bill Watts was there. I'm like, you know, who the fuck am I? It's not like today where the schlub that sets up the ring, when the owner of the company comes in, the ring guy has to come up and make sure, shake your hand. Hello, yes, hello. Where'd this handshake thing come from? That when you first got into business, would you have gone over and interrupted Eddie Graham and Hiro Matsuda?
No.
Would I have gone up in the corner, Jimmy Crockett and Dusty Rhodes are huddled up like this, and I'm going to come from the back and come over to shake their hand and say, yeah, I'm interrupting your conversation, but just want you to know I'm in the building. Where the fuck did this shit come from?
I have no idea.
But anyway, I digress. The point is, so it was a couple of years after that, and Crockett bought it. He tried to keep, for a while, it separate, because he was trying to collect the television stations and television coverage that the Central States had and Florida had and UWF had, et cetera, so he could put the syndicated package together, but it didn't work. But where I was going, that's the first time we got to work with Mike Graham.
Yeah.
And I got to be honest, you know, I saw him at the show in Memphis, and a couple of times I'd seen him on TV, but I thought, well, you know, he's the boss's son, and he's never really been anywhere else.
Right.
He didn't have to be. But the first thing he said was it was him and Rex King, little Rex King, and nobody believed could whip cream with an outboard motor. And first thing he said was, I'm going to do the job, because if you beat him, it won't mean anything. Second thing, get the heat on me and give him a false tag, let him have a little comeback, and then blah, blah, blah. he did the whole thing and set the whole thing up. His work was tremendous, but it looked like he pretty much had the whole match because Rex was just underneath guy at that point. And either we got the heat on him or he was shining or whatever. And then at the end, he's making it. Then he starts his own comeback. And the finish, as I jump up on the apron to scream at the referee, he's going to roll one of my guys up. My guy drops flat, and he runs. And I throw up my racket at the last second, and he runs headfirst into the loaded racket, knocks himself out, and the Midnight Express beat him. So he did most of the shine.
Right.
We got the heat on him. False tag, he made his own comeback and beat himself, and we got over, and he's a tremendous worker, and everybody looked like $1 million.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, now I see where he got it from, you know, and what the whole thing about Mike was. So that was an eye-opener.
Well, I'll tell you how good a guy he was when we were tag team champions, when we tagging, I dropped the fall for 2 years, okay? When I went off on my own and went to Atlanta, TV champion, and Knoxville and different places, Mike would make sure that they booked him against me, and he'd do the job for me. I mean, I did it in about 5 or 6 territories with him. So he was trying to pay me back for my hard work for him. And, you know, not many guys do that, you know what I mean? Especially like you said, the boss's son, and he didn't have to do this. He didn't even have to work.
I bet George Goulas never did that.
No, the jet set.
He had Bobby Eaton to lose all the falls and do all the work. All right, in Florida, or then maybe outside of Florida, who's your favorite opponent? Who's the best guy you ever worked with to make money or to have fun? And who's the best wrestler you've seen?
Best wrestler?
Yeah, in your opinion.
Ray Stevens, Johnny Valentine. Real thin line.
Yeah.
I mean, Mark Lewin's up there, babyface or heel. You know, and I'm going to throw some names out for people that never get the nod. Brad Armstrong was.
Yeah.
God, he was great. Ray Stevens was another really good guy. I was in San Francisco, and I got a little break there, and they brought him in to be my partner. And
you get to team with Ray Stevens in San Francisco.
Yeah. So I came up to him and I said, Ray, they want a DQ, and because we were against the Von Brauners and they were the champs, I said they want a DQ. What if I sell for you, give you a tag, and what do you think we could use for a finish? He said, no, you got it all wrong on that. Oh, Jesus. He said, I'm selling for you. This is your town now. You make the comeback. We'll end up going to the floor with both of them, and we'll have a count out. He said, but you make the comeback. And he went out and sold, and I'm in the ring. And Rick, I'm sorry, but that ain't the upside down bump.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That is not the upside down bump. And I mean, I was watching him, and it was like watching a river.
And this at the time, he'd been wrestling for 25 years, right?
30.
Or 30 at that point.
Yeah. And I mean, another guy.
You know what? And I understand, when everybody does it now, they grab the middle rope, and of course Rick goes a little sideways because of his back, and I can understand that. But everybody grabbed it, and Michael's made it look so pretty, it doesn't hurt, and it's all flippy floppy and everything. But Stevens, you couldn't even tell when he turned. They just, like the old-fashioned arm whip, where they would grab the wrist with both hands and just yank like that, and one little yank, and somehow he made it visually plausible that just that one little yank, as he was already running full speed across, he would fly upside down, wouldn't grab anything. The shoulders would hit the middle, the ass would hit the top.
Yeah.
He'd go up over, come back down, boom, just instantly. And the hell, how did that happen? It was amazing.
I mean, I've been lucky, and you have too, Jimmy. We've seen some, Bobby, okay?
Yeah.
But we've seen some great performers in our day, and they're all different, you know what I mean? Even though the Sheik was violence, you have to be a great performer to stay that long.
And in his younger days, he was a hell of an athlete and showed that. It's just as he got older, that's what worked for him.
But the other one is Valentine. You know, it took him a while to get over because he was so believable. He beat you to death. But I was in St. Louis with him one time, and going to St. Louis was a big deal, right, for anybody. And I always got along good with him, and I actually went 15 minutes with him on TV when it was Beat the Champ, the Silver Dollars.
Yeah.
Came over to me and said, you think you can carry me for 15 minutes? I went, what? He said, yeah, we're going to go through 15 minutes. And he was going for the elbow, and he was just like, move, you know. And he was whacking me, and I'd fight back. But I would talk to him about psychology sometimes, and I said, Johnny, how do you do it? You know, go on. I'm stupid. Let me in on it. He said, I'll show you tonight. He goes out and he had that black robe, and he looked terrific. You know, Johnny looked like a wrestler, didn't he? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he takes off the robe. And
The atomic blonde.
Yeah. As he's taking off the robe, he stops taking off the robe, and he's looking up at the top balcony in St. Louis. So I'm saying, what the hell is he looking at? And I see about, just like right here, the 4 guys start screaming. What the fuck's he looking at, right?
Yeah.
Before he took off the robe, he had them ready to jump off the balcony. And it was just that eye contact. He looked so vicious, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's kind of scares you, like a bad dog, you know what I mean? He looked like a bad dog. I mean, he was amazing.
And also part of that art is making the people notice what you're looking at without letting them know that you're wanting them to notice what you're looking at. So you look and you do a little double take, and then you can't resist. You have to look more, and then all of a sudden you start getting hot about it. And now now people are, what's he looking like you were? And by the time you get, it could be nobody up there, but you like that. Now they're fucking hot. You're looking at nothing.
Yeah.
But you can't let them know that you're wanting them to eavesdrop on you. They have to be catching you doing something that, you know what I'm saying.
And this is what I think's wrong with the business. They never got the rub with the guys that they should have. You know what I mean?
We lost a generation.
Yeah.
We lost a generation in all that bullshit in the 90s.
Yeah.
And the guys that knew how to do it were making a lot of money and didn't really particularly give a shit, some of them, about bringing the other guys up. Didn't want to lose a spot. And a lot of the guys just went home. The promoters that knew how to do all this stuff. They said, okay, well, we got our money or we lost our money, but one way or another, we're at home. We'll see you later. And you know, we lost a generation. Now they all started trying to figure it out for themselves, but they're like going back trying to find that missing link. Where did we go? But anyway, regardless, we have taken a trip to Championship Wrestling from Florida, and before we close out this marathon edition of everything you wanted to know about everything we've ever talked about, what's your favorite Florida memory, and what do you think? What's your favorite Florida memory, and what would have happened if Eddie Graham had lived? How long would Florida wrestling have gone on before the eventual happened?
I think he might have been able to work out something with Vince. You know what I mean? I think he might have said, hey, listen, you're going to need a place to send guys.
Yeah.
Send me a few guys like, you know, Smoky Mountain or
OVW.
Valley. I think he might have been.
And how old was he? Was 50-something at the time? Late 50s? He wasn't that old?
He was 54 or 5.
Yeah. So that was in 1985.
Yeah.
He would have been, he was Pat Patterson's age.
Yeah.
He would have been 70 during the Attitude Era.
Right.
Can you imagine Eddie Graham giving finishes to Stone Cold Steve Austin and The
That'd
Rock?
be incredible.
I think I just got a stiffy. Kevin, thank you very much.
So long from the Sunshine State.
State of Florida.